Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights, and let the dread begin. Around the 1950s, interdimensional rifts began appearing across the world. At first, they seemed harmless, mere anomalies in space that had no visible impact on our reality. However, nearly a decade later, strange occurrences began. Objects started disappearing and reappearing minutes later. At first, it was insignificant things, keys, books, cutlery. But as time passed, the scale of these anomalies escalated. Larger objects vanished without explanation. Then people began to disappear. At first, those who went missing would return after a short time, seemingly unharmed but with no memory of what had happened. But as the years went on, the disappearances grew longer, days, weeks, even months. Most of the returnees had no recollection of where they had been, as if time itself had erased their experiences. However, a few unfortunate individuals did remember, and what they described left them deeply traumatized. They spoke of incomprehensible landscapes, of being watched by something unseen, of hearing whispers in languages no human had ever spoken. Some returned in far worse conditions, missing limbs, their bodies bearing impossible wounds. What was most disturbing was that these injuries showed signs of advanced healing, as though they had been missing for years despite the person being gone only a short while. The medical impossibility of this suggested one terrifying conclusion. Wherever they had gone, time moved at a drastically different rate than our own. As these incidents became more frequent and more disturbing, governments and scientific institutions scrambled for answers. In response, a secret organization was formed to study, and if possible, contain these anomalies. This organization became known as the Walker Foundation, named after its founder, the late Dr. Walker. Now, you may be wondering why I'm telling you all this. Well, I was a researcher for the foundation, stationed at Phoenix Ridge Institute, the very heart of their operations, the mother base of all research into these phenomena. I had graduated at the top of my class at Harvard with a degree in quantum theory. My theories on interdimensional physics had gained some traction in certain academic circles, but apparently, they also caught the attention of the foundation. I would love to say that when they offered me a position, I had the freedom to decline. But that wasn't the case. If I recall correctly, their exact words were, "Due to your knowledge of the anomalies, you have two choices: work for us or go 6 feet under." So, as you can imagine, I didn't have much of a choice. Now, what I'm about to tell you is technically classified information. But considering that I'm currently bleeding out, I might as well not die for nothing. Someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to understand what came through the rift and why it must never happen again. It all started a few months after I began working at the Institute. By then, I had settled into the routine, grown accustomed to the endless security clearances, the sleepless nights spent analyzing data, and the unsettling hum of machines scanning things that shouldn't exist. Despite the secrecy and the ever-present feeling that we were meddling in forces far beyond our comprehension, Phoenix Ridge had started to feel like a second home. And I had even made a friend, Mark. I still remember the first day we met. It was during lunch, and I was sitting alone in the courtyard, absent-mindedly picking at the food on my tray. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and sterilized metal, the kind of artificial cleanliness that never quite masked the deeper sense of decay. I had barely taken a bite when I heard someone pull up a chair beside me. "They threatened to kill you too, huh?" I blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. For a second, I just stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was joking. He wasn't. There was something in his expression, an understanding, a shared weight, that told me he already knew my answer. I exhaled, giving a dry, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, gotta love a job offer you can't refuse." Mark smirked and sat down across from me, setting his tray down with a clatter. "Welcome to the club, then." The press ganged into top-secret science society. Perks include constant surveillance, ethically questionable experiments, and the ever-present possibility of being retired if you learn too much. I stabbed at my food with a fork, suddenly not feeling very hungry. "Sounds like a dream." "Oh, it gets better," Mark said, lowering his voice. "Wait until you see what they're hiding in Sublevel 6. Phoenix Ridge sat perched on a mountain, nestled deep within an expanse of dense, untamed wilderness. There wasn't a single sign of civilization for miles, no towns, no roads, nothing but towering evergreens and jagged rock formations stretching endlessly into the horizon. The perfect place for a top-secret organization that no one needed to know existed. On the surface, it looked unassuming, a simple, sterile-looking research facility with little more than a few hangars, administrative buildings, and the occasional armed patrol. But that was just the facade. The real Phoenix Ridge wasn't above ground. It was buried deep within the mountain, descending into the very crust of the earth like a subterranean labyrinth of reinforced steel and concrete. The deeper you went, the more restricted things became. Security checkpoints, biometric scans, armed guards at every turn. Each level housed secrets more dangerous than the last. My clearance only allowed me access up to sublevel 5, where research teams studied anomalies in controlled environments. Beyond that, I had no idea. Anything past sublevel 5 wasn't just restricted, it didn't officially exist. At least, that's what I thought. Somehow, Mark had managed to get his hands on a sublevel 6 access card. I never asked how. Some things were better left unknown. "It'll be fine," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights. He flashed me a grin, though there was a nervous edge to it. "As long as we go between guard shifts, they won't catch us." I swallowed hard, glancing down at the stolen access card in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have. "And if they do?" I asked. Mark smirked. "Then we run like hell." So we did it. We went down to sublevel 6. It was surprising how easy it was. Too easy. Mark and I expected resistance, security patrols, automated defenses, something to stop us from going where we weren't supposed to. But there was nothing. Just an open corridor, dimly lit by flickering fluorescence, stretching into the depths of Phoenix Ridge. No cameras followed us, no alarms blared. It felt like we had walked into a place long since abandoned. If only I had taken that emptiness more seriously. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing against the cold metal floor. The silence was unnatural, sterile and absolute, as if the entire level had been sealed away from the rest of the world. Then came the smell. Thick, coppery, the scent of blood. Mark's grip on the stolen access card tightened. He gestured toward a set of reinforced doors ahead, marked with bold red warnings. Biological hazard. Level 6 clearance required. Authorized personnel only. "This has to be it," Mark whispered. I didn't want to go in. Every nerve in my body told me that whatever had been locked away behind those doors should stay locked away. But Mark had already swiped the card. The scanner flickered green. The doors groaned open. A wave of thick, damp air rushed out, heavy with decay. I gagged, my stomach twisting at the stench. Mark covered his nose with his sleeve, his face pale. We stepped inside. The chamber was massive, stretching into darkness beyond the reach of the overhead lights. Reinforced glass containment units lined the walls, their interiors clouded with frost. Some were still sealed. Others were shattered, thick cracks spiderwebbing across the glass, dark stains pooling beneath them. And then there were the handprints. Everywhere, smeared across the walls, trailing down the floor. Some were human. Others had too many fingers. Mark took a slow step forward. "Jesus," he muttered. "What the hell happened here?" Then we heard it. A sound like wet fabric sliding across metal. Something moving in the dark. Slow. Methodical. A dragging sound. Mark and I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The noise was coming from the far end of the chamber, past the broken containment units, past the streaks of dried blood. Then it came into view. A figure. Humanoid but wrong. Its skin was stretched taut, sickly pale beneath the dim lights. Its arms were too long, its fingers gnarled and stiff. The way it moved was unsettling, its legs bent at unnatural angles, yet it carried itself with an eerie, effortless grace. But it was the body it dragged that made my stomach lurch. The corpse was massive, easily twice the creature's size. A man in a tattered lab coat, his arms limp, his skull caved in. A body that should have been too heavy for something so thin, so frail-looking. Yet the thing pulled it with ease, like it weighed nothing at all. Mark inhaled sharply. "We need to." The thing dropped the body and started moving. Fast. Mark barely had time to finish his sentence before the thing lunged. It didn't move like something that had learned to walk. It moved like something that had learned to chase. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, snapping into place like a puppet on tangled strings, but its speed was terrifying. The moment it dropped the body, it closed half the distance between us in seconds. Mark grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. "Run!" We bolted. Our boots pounded against the floor, our breath ragged. The door was still open. If we could just reach it. A sharp clang rang out behind us. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing had hit the ground, not tripped, not collapsed. It had just dropped, like its legs had suddenly given out. Its arms twitched, its fingers flexing against the floor, nails scraping against the metal. Then it started to rise. Not like a person getting up, like something being pulled upright by invisible strings. I felt bile rise in my throat, the way its joints twisted, the way its body convulsed. It was like it didn't have full control over itself, like it wasn't meant to be moving at all. Yet it was, and it was getting faster. Mark made it to the doorway first. He slammed his hand against the panel. The door hesitated, just a second, but a second too long. The thing let out a sound. Not a scream, not a growl. A deep, guttural clicking, like bones snapping over and over again in its throat. And then it jumped. I barely dove through the doorway in time. Mark hit the override panel on the other side, and the metal doors slammed shut just as the creature collided with them. The impact shook the walls. A second later, something scraped against the metal. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging along the surface. Then silence. I slumped against the opposite wall, chest heaving. Mark was beside me, hands shaking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Neither of us could. Then Mark turned to me, his face pale. "We need to get the hell out of here." I nodded, forcing myself to stand. "Yeah, but first." I glanced at the terminal near the door. It had a security log. I swiped the screen, scrolling back to the last recorded entries. My stomach dropped. The logs ended 3 weeks ago, and the last recorded entry was from Dr. Adams. Log 4. Sebastian really messed up. I told him the rift was too unstable, that it needed to be contained. But he wouldn't listen. He never listened. And now, because of his arrogance, I'm watching that stubborn fool being torn apart. His screams won't stop. I can hear the wet crunch of bone, the tearing of flesh, the thing's guttural growls between bites. I should look away, but I can't. I know I'm next. Whoever is reading this, listen to me carefully, run. Run as fast as you can. That thing cannot be killed. We tried. God knows we tried. Bullets, fire, electric surges, it only seemed to amuse it. And it's hungry. If my calculations are correct, it has enough food down here to last 3 weeks. After that, when the bodies are gone, it will start hunting. It will need to hunt. And if you're anywhere nearby when that happens, you won't have time to react. We should have killed it the moment we had the chance. Why do we always choose research over survival? Why do we insist on understanding what only wants to consume us? This entity, it's classified as a beta, and we've only ever documented 2 betas since the Foundation was established. The first wiped out an entire containment facility before we could even classify its behavior. This one might be worse. The others are gone. The doors won't hold. And I can hear it moving again. The crunching stopped. Oh God, it's done eating. End of log. Mark and I didn't waste another second. The scraping sound against the door had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, like the thing on the other side was waiting, calculating. I didn't want to find out what it was planning. "We need to get to the surface," Mark said, his voice low but urgent. "If that thing gets out of sublevel 6, the whole facility is done for." I nodded, my mind racing. The security logs had mentioned that the entity had enough food to last 3 weeks. If the logs ended 3 weeks ago, that meant it was out of food. And if it was out of food, it would start hunting. We were the closest prey. We moved quickly but quietly, retracing our steps through the dimly lit corridors. The air felt heavier now, charged with a tension that made every sound, every creak of metal, every hum of machinery, feel like a warning. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the same fear reflected in Mark's eyes. As we reached the elevator, Mark swiped his stolen access card. The doors slid open with a soft ding, and we stepped inside. I hit the button for sublevel 1, the surface level, but the elevator didn't move. Instead, the lights flickered, and a cold draft seeped through the cracks in the doors. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, jabbing the button again. The elevator shuddered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to work. But then the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on a second later, casting an eerie red glow over the small space. "We're not alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark didn't respond, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the red haze, but it did little to ease the growing sense of dread. The elevator jerked suddenly, and we both stumbled. The doors creaked open, but we weren't on sublevel 1. We were somewhere deeper, somewhere we hadn't been before. The corridor beyond was dark, the walls lined with pipes and wires that hissed and sparked. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, and the floor was slick with something I didn't want to identify. Mark shone the flashlight down the corridor, revealing a series of doors, each marked with the same red warnings we'd seen on sublevel 6. "This isn't right," Mark said, his voice tight. "We didn't go down. We should be going up." I didn't have an answer. The elevator had taken us somewhere it wasn't supposed to, and I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't a malfunction. Something had brought us here. We stepped out of the elevator cautiously, the doors sliding shut behind us with a finality that made my stomach churn. The corridor stretched ahead, disappearing into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. "We need to move," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, and we started down the corridor, the beam of the flashlight our only guide. The doors we passed were all sealed, their warning labels faded and peeling. Some of them had handprints, human and otherwise, smudged across the glass. Then we heard it, the sound of something moving, dragging itself across the floor. It was close, too close. Mark swung the flashlight around, and the beam caught something in the shadows, a figure, hunched and twisted, its two long limbs splayed at unnatural angles. It was the beta entity. It turned its head slowly, its eyes reflecting the light like a predator's. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out that same guttural clicking sound we'd heard before. "Run!" Mark shouted, and we took off down the corridor. The thing was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It moved like a spider, its limbs skittering across the walls and ceiling as it chased us. I could hear it gaining on us, the sound of its claws scraping against metal growing louder with every second. We rounded a corner, and Mark slammed his hand against a control panel. A door slid open, and we dove through, the door slamming shut behind us. The thing hit the door with a force that shook the walls, and I heard the sound of claws digging into metal. "This way," Mark said, pulling me down another corridor. We ran until we reached a stairwell, the door marked with a sign that read "Surface Access." Mark yanked the door open, and we started up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The sound of the beta entity faded behind us, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, hunting. When we finally reached the surface, the cold night air hit me like a slap. The stars were bright overhead, and the moon cast a pale light over the facility. But there was no time to appreciate the view. We needed to get as far away from Phoenix Ridge as possible. Mark led the way to a parked jeep near the entrance. He jumped into the driver's seat, and I climbed in beside him. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the mountain road, the facility disappearing behind us in a cloud of dust. For a moment, I thought we might actually make it. Then the jeep lurched violently, and the world spun. I barely had time to register what was happening before we crashed into a tree, the impact throwing me against the dashboard. Pain shot through my side, and I tasted blood in my mouth. I looked over at Mark. He was slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling down his face. "Mark!" I shouted, shaking him. "Wake up!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You need to go." "Not without you," I said, trying to pull him out of the jeep. But he pushed me away, his strength surprising me. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "That thing is still out there. It's not going to stop. You need to warn people. You need to tell them what's happening." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I can't do this alone." Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "You're not alone. You've got the logs. You've got the truth. Now go." I hesitated, but the sound of something moving in the trees made my blood run cold. The beta entity was close. Too close. Mark shoved me again, harder this time. "Go," he shouted. I stumbled back, my heart breaking as I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I heard the sound of the beta entity closing in, and I heard Mark's final, defiant shout. Then there was silence. I don't have much time. I can feel the blood pooling beneath me, the cold seeping into my bones. My vision is blurring, and every breath feels like a struggle. But I need to finish this. I need to tell you what happened. Someone has to know. Mark is gone. He didn't make it. We crashed the jeep trying to escape, and he stayed behind to buy me time. I don't know if it was enough. I don't know if I'm far enough away, but I can still hear it, the clicking, the scraping, the sound of something moving in the shadows. It's out there, and it's coming. I managed to send some of the logs before the crash. I don't know if they'll go through. The signal out here is spotty at best, and I don't even know who I sent them to. But if you're reading this, if you've seen the files, you need to listen. The Walker Foundation isn't what they say they are. They've been lying to everyone. The rifts, the entities, the experiments, it's all real. And it's worse than anyone could imagine. The thing we saw in sublevel 6, it's not human. It's not even from this world. It's something else, something that doesn't belong here. And it's not the only one. There are others. The Foundation has been studying them, trying to control them, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. These things, they're not just dangerous. They're wrong. They don't follow the rules of our reality. They don't think like we do. And they're hungry. I don't know how much longer I have. The pain is getting worse, and I can't feel my legs anymore. But I need to warn you. If you're near Phoenix Ridge, if you hear about strange disappearances or unexplained phenomena, run. Don't try to investigate. Don't try to help. Just get as far away as you can. And if you work for the Foundation, if you're reading this and you know what I'm talking about, you need to stop. Whatever they've told you, whatever they've promised you, it's not worth it. The things they're doing, they're playing with forces they can't control. And when it all goes wrong, and it will go wrong, there won't be anyone left to clean up the mess. I can hear it now. It's closer. The clicking, the scraping, it's right outside. I don't have much time. Please, if you're reading this, don't let this happen again. Don't let them keep lying. Don't let them keep experimenting. The rifts are real. The entities are real. And if we're not careful, they're going to destroy everything. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. It's here. How long does grieving last? I asked myself every single day for almost 3 years since my wife disappeared, and I never got an answer. The reminder that I was alone came every time I woke up and went to bed. Eventually, the reality sets in, and I start to get used to eating alone, brushing my teeth alone, grocery shopping alone, and just being alone. I thought enough time had passed that I didn't have to ask myself that question anymore, until the day I got a phone call from the nursing team who took care of my mother-in-law. Denise, the old lady, was planning on moving herself into a nearby nursing home, but now it sounds like she had 2 passed. When I arrived at their home, I was met by one of the nurses who had taken care of Denise. She tried to leave quickly, not wanting to stay around the house long. We had a small conversation about where everything was in the home, and how most of the things inside were packed up and ready for storage, and then were given a set of keys for the house, each labeled with the rooms inside. I tried to ask for more details, but all the nurse gave me was a passing chuckle as she turned to go to her car, getting inside and driving away without another word. It was a reasonable response when it involved anything that had to do with Denise. The old lady was going on 80 and was unbearable to be around. The last time I had spoken to her, most of our conversation was loud coughing and nonsense. The old house smelt like a hospital. Cardboard boxes were stacked randomly around the home, with a thin layer of dust blanketing each surface. The TV and larger furniture stayed unpacked, only covered in a layer of plastic wrap. I was married to my wife for 5 years before she vanished, and I don't recall ever being in her childhood home. The old house sat in a suburban row of homes, all facing away from the tree line leading into the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest. I stuffed the keys into my pockets and carefully squeezed between the stacked boxes. Small framed pictures of my wife at various ages still hung along the walls and sat across the small coffee table. I guess Denise wanted to take these in her bag, or maybe, like me, it was difficult to let her go. With no one left in the family, the responsibility fell on me to take care of what was left of their belongings. I figured I would get the boxes to storage and clean the rest of the house before deciding what to do with it. I loaded a couple into my car, staring at the dishes and kitchenware, before stumbling on a pile of boxes with her name written across them. Gwen, I read to the silent house. With a long, deep breath, I carried the boxes to the coffee table and opened them. Inside were articles of clothing, old-bound notebooks, photo albums, and school memorabilia. I flipped through them, and seeing her on every page brought tears. Her smile lit up each sun-faded page, and each wood frame she was captured in threatened to set on fire with her warmth. These boxes were going to stay with me. I dried my tears and kept going, wanting to see more of her. I moved away a pile of old clothes and notebooks when my hand met something hard and hollow. Buried at the bottom of one of the boxes were a hefty bag of small CDs and a handheld video camera. I pulled them out and immediately went to turn it on. Unsurprisingly, the old thing wouldn't turn on, and the battery compartment was corroded shut with the old batteries still inside. I wrestled with it in the kitchen with a butter knife and got it opened and cleaned. Then with the double as from the TV remote, got the thing to switch on. I inspected the camera again, excited to get it working, and saw it had a name written in marker on the side. Gwen. I shuffled through the CDs, each labeled with a date, a few not. The first was for her 8th birthday. The small red-haired girl's face was right up in the camera lens, peering in with her bright steel blue eyes. She let out an excited squeal and ran to hug her parents, thanking her mom and dad for the expensive gift. I guess filmmaking had always been her passion. Her father responded with something unintelligible and a heavy cough before he left the frame. I had never met the man when he was alive, and she never talked much about him. A moment later he returned with a big birthday cake, and then the three ate it together. The rest of the CD was just them eating before shutting off randomly. The old CDs didn't have that much storage, each having only about 20 minutes of memory. I spent the next few hours going through her childhood. Several moments in the videos I recall her telling me about, late nights when we would lay in bed and talk until sunrise. Other moments just small silly things a child with a video camera would film. Her father eventually showed up less and less in the videos, his cough worsening every time until he was no longer in them. For a long while the videos stopped, a large year-long gap before I saw her face again. Her smiles were never the same, she talked less, and some videos were just her talking about her day to her father and writing silently in her notebooks. Eventually, the pile of memories grew smaller and smaller, and when I almost reached the end of the dated discs, I decided to take a look at one without any date on it. Heavy breathing interlaced with the crackle of the built-in microphone blasted through the tiny speakers, filling up the empty home more than everything else that night. The screen was dark, with only a small light coming from the left corner of the video. The lens stuttered and focused. Eventually I was able to make out a line of trees and a street light, but the image was still blurred. It stayed focused on the dark woods for another moment before the camera was pushed forward, hitting a glass surface before it struggled to focus once again, the heavy breathing of my wife still close to the microphone. I leaned in, as if it would help the video focus, the blurry tree line being barely visible in the dark. Between the breaths of my wife, I could hear the camera force itself to focus, sharpening itself until the woods got steadily more and more visible. The camera stayed like that for 18 minutes, glued in position, and so did my wife. My eyes stayed trained on the trees, just like she was in the video, watching for any movement at all, only leaving the tree line to check the timer on the video. It got to 19 minutes, and then as it slowly reached its end something shifted in the trees. The video ended, blinding me with the harsh blue menu of the settings screen. Immediately I replaced the disc with another unmarked one. The next one was during the day. She stood just at the edge of the woods, camera raised and pointed towards the thick darkness created by the trees. The normally tranquil sounds of birds and nature in the background were sometimes interrupted by a heavy cough. Each time the camera fell for a moment, I imagined she tried to stifle her cough. I watched again to the end of this video, all 20 minutes of just the camera pointed into the woods, but nothing happened. The following 4 undated videos also showed nothing, just my wife, at various points and locations around her house, filming the woods for 20 minutes. The audio was always just background noise, coughing, and the mechanical whirl of the camera's focus. On the last dated one, I could see her reflection in the window as she filmed. She sat in the kitchen, the camera pointed towards the window above her sink, and the tree line beyond her yard. She was probably about 15 or 16 at this point, looking just like the first time we had met in high school. The camera tried to focus again on the woods, zooming between her reflection and the tree line. She let out another cough, this time just a brief one, and then opened a bottle of pills, swallowing them dry before letting the camera roll to its end. I had run out of CDs. I stood from my spot on the ground and turned towards the kitchen window. It was now nighttime, making the darkness of the tree line even more oppressing than it was a few moments earlier on the screen. I stood and stared for a moment like she did, trying to scan the dark with my eyes, but the trees stayed the same. With a shudder, I pulled the blinds down to shut the window and made my way back to with the help of my phone light. There were no more videos. I carelessly dumped out the rest of the boxes with her name on them across the floor and found nothing. Realizing what I'd done to what I had left of my wife, I started to mournfully repack her items neatly into the boxes when I accidentally kicked something across the ground. Her notebooks. I picked them up and laid them across the coffee table. There were only 3 of them, one of them a locked toy Barbie notebook that I wasn't going to get open unless I smashed the thing, and the other 2 old leather-bound style books. I carefully unwrapped the straps around them and flipped through the weathered pages, mostly filled with bits of writing and drawings. Across the 2 available notebooks, her art style visibly improved, and she wrote less and less. Like the videos, the drawings were about her and her parents. Unfortunately, they were almost exactly like the videos, chronicling and recording how her father eventually got more and more ill. The drawings and entries transitioned from them getting ice cream, hiking, and summer barbecues to hospital visits, sitting on their back porch and looking into the woods. Then it was just the woods. The second half of her 3rd notebook was just pages and pages of the trees, and nothing more, until the last 2 pages. The graphite of the pencil was aggressively forced into the paper, splaying out an image of the tree line into the last 2 pages of her notebook. I ran my fingers along each tree and could feel them etched into the page. The black powder left behind by her pencil so long ago still stained my fingertips. In the middle of the page, done by what I assumed was an eraser trying to remove the forest from the notebook, stood a gaunt figure towering over the trees. I closed the notebooks and set them back in the box and sealed them once again. I turned on every light in the house, first the entire ground floor, before making my way to the upstairs. I wanted to snuff out every single dark corner of this home, to chase away a fear I refused to acknowledge. I shifted through the keychain in my pocket, entered every room, and turned on every light until I reached the locked door at the end of the hallway. I had 1 key left, one with her name written on the small tag that clung to it. Gwen. 2 times the keys fell out of my hands until I finally got them into the lock. It didn't click like the rest of the doors, but instead, the lock turned with a rusted and sticky scrape. I thought Denise was joking when she said she had left my wife's room the same as the day she left and never opened it, but I realize now that she was telling the truth. I coughed hard as I pushed on the door. It took an agonizing amount of force to open, and as it did it pushed something across the floor, sending dust from on top of the door frame down on my head. My hand reached for where the light switch should be, but couldn't find anything. I opened the door wider, so that the light from the hallway could spill into the room enough for me to see. Her desk was stacked with at least 100 of the same leather-bound notebooks she had in her box, the strap barely holding them close as they were stuffed with extra sheets of paper. Scattered across the ground were even more of them, their pages ripped out. Moonlight tried to enter the room through the window, but was forced back by something covering the glass. I took out my phone to shine its light across the walls to see where the ripped pages went. Across every surface possible were drawings of the woods. If oversharing were a sport, Veronica would take Olympic gold. I'd like to say I'd known Roni all my life, and most people would believe it based on how much I knew about her. There wasn't any part of her life she didn't tell me. Stories, memories, and ideas flowed out of her effortlessly, restraint being a completely foreign concept to her. I never minded, though. I'm perfectly content to let her talk herself hoarse, even if my ears fell off. She needed the release as much as I needed the noise, an effortless symbiosis that powered our friendship. I knew how she almost cut her thumb off with a paring knife when she was 6, how she snuck 3 people into her room through her 3rd-story window, and where her mom hid the colored contacts. People couldn't even tell her mom wore them in the first place. Despite all of it, the stories, embarrassments, long nights watching scary movies, everything, she found ways to ask about me between breaths. My hobbies, interests, and aspirations were absorbed with as much clarity as her own. And she remembered too. She could recall fine details about anything, even if I'd only mentioned it once. For better or worse, Roni has a big memory, and an even bigger mouth. We went everywhere together, clinging to each other like conjoined twins. We were a package deal that wouldn't be separated. That's what made college that much more scary. High school finished unceremoniously, Roni graduating with high honors and a fancy scholarship to UPenn to study biochemistry. I didn't have the aptitude she had, so I settled on a quiet state school an hour from my house. In hindsight, I should have known the world wouldn't be kind enough to keep us together. I hadn't known her for that long, but it felt like a piece of me was scooped out, the space she occupied refusing to fill. I felt hollow, weak, gray. A promise to stay in touch and continue to talk every single day seemed just as hollow. Anyone in a long-distance relationship knows how Herculean a task like that can be, especially between college students. Over time, little by little, we fell out of touch. Calling every Sunday turned into every other Sunday, then a few times a month. I would respond to her posts, always being met with an enthusiastic, "Let's catch up soon," followed by even more weeks of silence. Time marched onward, and Roni receded further into my memory. By my senior year of college, I only thought of her when I smelled old pennies or lavender perfume, or when I'd go to our favorite coffee shop back home, times like that. After I graduated college, I found myself stuck. I was unsure of my expectations and equally unwilling to find out. My diploma says I had a degree in biology, but was that truly what I wanted to do in life? As many other broke college graduates come to realize, I probably should have figured that out before the loans piled up. With bills flooding my mailbox and no time to regret my decisions, I found a job at a body donation facility. Without bogging down the flow, this is the gist. The company connects the recently deceased with organizations that can use their bodies for science. Those who want to donate their bodies to further scientific and medical education are taken to the facility, processed, and dismembered according to the needs of the client. After that, their body parts are shipped to them in big, metal trucks all across the country. So, as the title suggests, my job is to process the donors, dismember them, and package them. Lucky me. Despite the grotesque nature of the work itself, I work alongside a great team, the pay is good, and I finally feel like I've carved a path for myself. If that means I have to work in a literal ice box with dead bodies every day, so be it. Adjusting to the smell was easier than I expected, the N95 doing most of the heavy lifting. But even for the more difficult aspects, it was relieving to know I had good co-workers to lean on if I needed it. Unfortunately, this seemed to be one of those days. Aaron, the most senior of us, was the de facto leader, responsible for reading out the orders, indicating what specimen needed to be procured from a given donor. Lukewarm coffee in hand, she scanned through her clipboard, occasionally blurting out procurement notes. Patient 5. Cephalic, bilateral, P3, and eviscerate. Who wants it? Cephalic means head, bilateral means both arms, P3 was shorthand for pelvis to toes, and eviscerate means, well, exactly what it sounds like. Calling them our patients always made me chuckle, but it felt more natural than calling them donors. We obviously weren't treating them, but we handled them with the same level of care. After a pause, Jesse's hand rose lazily. Yeah, sure, I got it. Also, how many total today again? 11 total, Aaron replied, eyes never leaving the clipboard. Ideally, we'll be out of here on time. Don't fuck anything up, Messy. Jesse scowled at her, her faint grin peeking out from over the clipboard. He grumbled out a weak retort, Nina, Ty and I snickering at the two of them. Aaron continued, the 5 of us silently choosing our patients for the day. We all ended up with 2 patients, Aaron solemnly taking the extra. She droned through the memos, gave us a curt nod, and shooed us toward the changing rooms. The mornings were always slow, but we had the luxury of working at our own pace. We gowned up in silence, slipping our masks and goggles on before moving to the box. The box, as it was affectionately nicknamed, was our workspace. Large metal lab tables lined the windowless room, blinking LEDs above each one. An industrial tool closet sat in the far corner of the room, housing all of our daily equipment. Contrary to my assumptions, the box was typically flooded with a pungent lemony smell instead of the stench of death. The scented chemical cleaners cemented a permanent citrus odor into the space, interrupted only by the assault that was procurement. The worst part of the box was the ventilation, predictably. Massive gusts of air pumped into the room, just cold enough for us to work on the donors without freezing ourselves. A neat row of human-sized cubby holes lined the back wall, all of them adorned with walk-in freezer handles. Canvas-covered gurneys were parked against the other wall, a line of mottled gray toes peeking out from the end of each one. The only color in the room was the neon yellow tags separating each donor, tied to the big toes like yard signs. Ty yawned audibly, dragging his hand through the tags before moving to the tool closet, flicking on our portable speaker on the way. Aight, who needs what? Anything specific or just the use? Just scalpel and saw for me, please, I chirped, the mask muffling most of my voice. Ty flashed me a thumbs up, taking requests from each of us in order. Setting my supplies aside, I found my first patient and wheeled them out to my table. Each patient always had their documentation at their feet, complete with a medical history, cause of death, and procurement details. I quickly scanned the paper, eager to get the first one out of the way as Led Zeppelin crackled out from the speakers. Peeling back the canvas, I greeted my first patient, their shriveled gray face and milky eyes offering no reply. My face tightening reflexively, I went through my usual assessment. I checked his entire body for surgery and fracture scars, peeled back his eyelids for any corneal abrasions, gently palpated his stomach for any excess gastrointestinal movement, and flexed all of his appendages. All scars accounted for, no abrasions, no GI movement, and all appendages had full flexion and extension. Writing down my notes, I watched as his half-open eyelid drooped close, gravity attempting to revert my inspection. Aaron often had to remind me that it's not like they're gonna protest, but it still gave me the creeps watching bodies move without my help, especially after jostling them around so much. Forcing my goosebumps to recede, I was interrupted by Nina, a look of indignation plastered on her face. "Hey, you good over there, Nina?" "Huh? Oh yeah, sorry. Check this out though. Poor girl." I set the documents down, all of us now clustered around Nina's patient. She was just as gray as my patient, but her face was covered with purple bruises, a long gash wedged between her eyebrows. From a quick scan, I figured maybe it was from a fall, but her torso told another story. A smattering of brown and purple bruises painted her skin, her chest visibly concaving in the center of it all. She had to be no older than mid-50s, younger than the majority of our patients. I caught a pitted sigh from Aaron, striding over to gently palpate the stomach. A wretched crunch and gurgle escaped the woman, a dark maroon pool rising in their mouth. Wincing at the guttural noise, I watched the donor's sallow stomach distend once more, the pool in her mouth draining back inside her. "Ugh, how tragic. Car accident, yeah?" "Yeah," Nina sighed, eyes downcast. "No older than my mom, too. Just terrible." She trailed off, the rest of us digesting the scene. Ty, the least experienced of us, chimed in. "So wait, that was her blood? How does that work?" "Well," Aaron grunted, wiping her hands on her smock, "most likely rupture from the crash. Internal bleeding from an aortic rupture, I'd say." "Nina, she have eviscerate orders?" Nina slipped her gloves off, flipping through the folder of documents carefully. "Nope, not her. Violet forearms, knee down, and pelvis." "Why?" "We're gonna have to discard the rest anyway, so after y'all finish your first procurement, we can check out what happened together." She patted the patient's bony shoulder, the rest of us nodding eagerly. "Hey Jesse, slide that trash over here." Jesse positioned the trash beside the patient's ribs, already knowing where this was going. With practiced precision, Aaron lined up a scalpel blade between ribs 9 and 10, dragging the blade swiftly between them. Tar-black ichor drained from the incision, a sickly waterfall of blood cascading into the trash noiselessly. "Give, 20 minutes draining before you go for that pelvis. Unless you feel like getting showered." Nina shrugged playfully, Jesse's eyes puckering beneath his goggles. "Hey, not this early, Ninny. I've already queued just to get high, and I don't want my tears mixing with your gut juice." We all groaned in unison, the mere mention of Nickelback putting a bad taste in our mouths. Jesse raised his hands defensively, Ty giving him a light punch on the arm before sauntering over to his table again. Smiling inside my mask, I walked over to my station, immigrant song gracing my ears once more. My first patient was a cephalic, Violet hands, an AP3. Going for the head first was always a pain, but it made the weight distribution for the P3 a little more manageable. Cradling his head in my arms, scalpel at the ready, I glanced up at the row of gurneys. For whatever reason, the last one in the row caught my eye, and it only took a moment to realize why. Despite all donors having a yellow ticket on the toe, one gurney at the end of the line was missing theirs. I frowned, hoping Ty didn't lose it accidentally. Counting as I went, the last gurney had no paperwork or tag anywhere in sight, my frown turning to intrigue. "Hey Aaron," I called out over my shoulder. "You sure we only had 11 today?" Aaron looked up from her donor, scalpel in hand. "Yep. Just 11 today." "What's up?" "There's an extra in the line. Late arrival." It wasn't uncommon for us to get 1 or 2 donors delivered throughout the day, but they were always dropped off with their paperwork and yellow tag. Aaron groaned, already irritated at the possibility of lost paperwork. "Wasn't told about any extras today. Maybe they just came early? To be processed tomorrow." "Fair enough, but wouldn't they have their documents and stuff? Personal effects too." "I mean, they're supposed to," Aaron continued, sidling up at the foot of the gurney. She peeked under the tarp, squatting down to look around and underneath the donor. "Huh, guess they're missing theirs. Mind wheeling them over to the auxiliary freezers down the hall?" I'll try to get a hold of our delivery guys and see what the deal is." "No problem," I replied, setting my current patient's head down. I traded spots with Aaron, rolling the mystery donor down the dark hallway to auxiliary storage. Beyond the strange lack of documentation and yellow tag, other things felt off about the donor. As the gurney's badwill echoed noisily, I noticed their toes were much pinker than other donors were. It wasn't unheard of to get a young donor, but it was certainly rare, and all the sadder. The canvas had a thin layer of dust on it too, typical of donors who've been left out for a few days. I certainly don't remember anyone behind on their work, especially for a donor this young. What gives? Was this supposed to be in our caseload today? I shook off the notion. Erin is a robot when it comes to bookkeeping. She wouldn't have forgotten one. Stepping into the auxiliary freezer room, I pushed my donor toward the nearest open cubby, the freezer door already open for preservation. Lining them up with the cubby, I suddenly stopped cold, a wave of confusion climbing up my spine. They didn't just move, did they? No, I saw something move for sure, but that can't be. I must have moved funny when I was lining them up. Scrunching up my face, I grabbed the corner of the canvas, intent on ripping it off and onto the floor, but I was stopped yet again. Movement. A shift underneath, near the face. I knew I wasn't imagining it, but then... What? How? I swallowed hard, unable to process the scene as I dragged the canvas off. Finally exposed, I sighed in relief, laughing at myself sheepishly. Her paperwork was just sitting on her face instead of her legs. Of course it would shift as I repositioned her. I shook my head in embarrassment, thankful Jesse or Ty weren't there to make fun of me. The donor was indeed young, a cavalcade of blonde hair spilling out behind the thick manila folder. Her hands rested gently at her sides, palms toward the sky in peace. Her skin was remarkably clean, bereft of any bruising or scar tissue, save for a nearly imperceptible scar on her thumb, just below the joint. I blinked for a moment, processing silently. So if she does have her paperwork, I should bring her back, right? Picking up the documents, intent on finding their filing date, her face shot spikes through me. Eyes anchored on her visage, the folders slipped from my grasp, the sounds of falling paper echoing in the isolated room. Mouth agape and hands trembling, I grabbed the wall for support as a torrent of memories overwhelmed my senses, my breathing rapid and shallow. It was Roni. Her cheeks were slightly pink, but she was most certainly dead. I wheezed through my mask, the world refusing to stop spinning. Worst of all, with her eyes half open and palms to the sky, she was smiling. Smiling like a fool, teeth glittering in the low light, not another wrinkle in sight. The color drained from my face, a torrent of physical shock setting in. I wanted to scream, I wanted to puke, and I wanted to leave. Even now, writing this, I don't know what compelled me to stay, but I eventually hobbled over to her, my eyes the size of dinner plates. Hundreds of questions flooded my brain, spiraling into a vortex of panic and grief. Then all at once, it merged into a perfect, all-encompassing dread. Roni's eyelids drifted closed, moving without my help. My grandfather passed away during a blizzard. It was a freak October storm that tore through the Northeast like a knife through butter. I remember my mom calling him in a panic, and I could hear his gruff, dismissive tone over the phone. Pappy Jerry was like that often. Despite being damn near 80, he insisted on staying in his decaying home. It was nearly 2 weeks before the roads were clear enough, and Mom made the pilgrimage to Pappy's homestead. When she arrived, she discovered he had been completely snowed in. She called out to no response, and began digging. She had found Pappy glued to his porch chair, frost and icicles still clinging to his ghostly visage. He was bundled up, yes, but he was as stiff as a board, a broad smile etched onto his face forever. The screaming began shortly after this discovery. Paramedics had tried desperately to calm my poor mother, but they ended up having to restrain her. Cops on the scene were bewildered. He was sat perfectly in his rickety old chair. His expression was that of joy and mania. The strange thing is, as the first responders and paramedics began to clear away the snow, they found evidence that someone had built snowmen in the yard. 2 or 3 large snowmen with button eyes and gumball smiles littered Grandpa Jerry's front lawn. Mom never truly recovered from discovering her father's remains. She was sitting quietly in the back during the funeral, a veil hiding her hysterics. She would wake up screaming in the night, and my dad would hold her as she sniffled and wept into his arms. Every time I visited home, she seemed to get worse and worse. Some days she would just sit in the den, curled up with quilts and heavy blankets staring into space. When the time came to clear out Granddad's place, it was left to me and my dad. The inside of his decrepit tomb was a hoarder's wet dream. Newspaper lined the walls, and the floor was a parade of trash and dust. It took over 3 dozen trash bags just to clear out his den. The kitchen was a moldy mess, the bathroom a biohazard, and the bedroom stank to high heaven. I was shocked at the state of it, honestly. Jerry had become a recluse past couple year, but I remember him being very outgoing and clean. He used to travel and world and bring back all sorts of trinkets and toys to spoil us grandkids with. Which leads us to the lamp. The lamp was tucked away in the corner of a dresser. I scoffed when I found it. It looked like the most stereotypical Arabian lamp you could ever see. It looked like Jerry had plucked it right out of a Disney movie. I heard rustling behind me and turned to see my dad carefully tearing the crusty sheets off Jerry's mattress. I held it up for him to see, like jingling keys for a baby. Dad eyed the lamp and let out a hearty chuckle. "That's your grandpa's old gin lamp," he replied so casually. "It's his what?" I sputtered with laughter. "Yeah, Jerry picked it up at some market in God knows whereiston." My father explained. "He'd show it off at parties, dare people to rub it, that sort of thing." I don't know if he actually believed in it, but he'd get super pissed if anyone called it a genie lamp. Said it was disrespectful. To that he shrugged his shoulders. I glanced down at the lamp skeptically. I pocketed it and returned to my work. A magic lamp sounds crazy, but in the back of my mind I remembered something. When my mom was growing up, Grandpa Jerry lost his job. Money was tight for a long time, until one day Grandpa came home grinning ear to ear. He said money wasn't going to be an issue any longer, and that he didn't want his little Sarah to worry any longer. It was true. Grandpa then had a seemingly endless supply of cash, said his investments had finally paid off. My mother could never recall what exactly he invested in, but the money flow didn't end until she graduated college. That's when some swindler got Grandpa to invest in a pyramid scheme, and he lost everything. But he didn't care. He was just happy my mother had been taken care of. I thought about that old family fable the rest of the day. A raging storm of what-ifs fondled my mind as I pawed at the lamp in my hand. Laying on my bed, I studied the thing. How did they do it in the fairy tales? Rub it 3 times or something like that. I was hesitant at first, but found myself more curious than anything. I rubbed the lamp 3 times and nothing. There was a dead silence in my room. Outside I could hear crickets chirping, and I could feel my face flush with embarrassment. Wasn't sure why I was embarrassed. There was no one around but me. In a huff, I tossed the lamp aside and went back to scrolling on my phone. I was so engaged in the latest asinine reel, I didn't even hear it at first. SKRT. I paused my scrolling and looked up. SKRT. Again, that scatting noise like something was scratching up my walls. I turned my flashlight on and found nothing. SKRT. Right on my ear, I jerked backwards only to face my headboard. It's probably a mouse coming in from the cold, I thought, putting aside my fright. My phone dinged, and I glanced to find a snap from my friend Terry. It was some flirty pic overlaid with a dozen filters. I rolled my eyes and got ready to snap her back, turning my bedside lamp on. I tousled my hair and put on my best sleepy look as I pulled up the front-facing camera. My face then contorted in confusion. There seemed to be a filter already on. It was my face all right, chiseled jawline, fluffy hair, and a well-trimmed black goatee. But my skin was a crimson hue, ears with tipped points, and my eyes were solid black with ruby iris staring back at me. I shuddered at the strange filter and tried to change it to something glossier. Switched it, nothing changed. Switched it to dog ears, nothing changed. Switched it to a damn ad filter, nothing changed. My heart skipped as the face on my phone began to smile. It leaned closer, like it was going to leap out of my phone. I threw it aside with a yelp. A light turned on from the hallway. I froze, realizing I hadn't heard my parents come in the driveway. Hello, I called out meekly. I was met with silence. My phone buzzed again, and I reached for it. It was a snap from an unknown user. I played it and was met with a video of my bathroom. The light turned on, blinding the camera. I could hear a muffled voice call out, "Hello," and the video ended. My eyes darted to the still-lit hall, and I got up, dreading what I would find in the bathroom. The upstairs hall was silent, illuminated only by the dim hum of the bath. I peeked my head inside, seeing nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement in the mirror. A dark shape loomed in it, its ruby-red glare dancing like flames. I opened my mouth about to let out a horrified shriek when I felt something grab me by the hand and yanked me into the bathroom. The door slammed shut behind me. The click of a lock rang out. I darted around in a panic, finally landing on the bathroom mirror. The twisted devil version of me stood where I did, grinning like a mad jackal. His hair seemed to movie about his own, this illusion giving off waves of contempt. He beckoned me forward and took a bow as I approached. "Forgive my theatrics, master. It's just been so long since I've received new company." The demon purred. Its voice was wavy yet graveled, like he was speaking through a broken speaker. "What are you?" I muttered under my breath. The demon did not break contact as he explained. "I am the Jinn of the lamp. You have rubbed it 3 times. Now I am your humble servant. You may call me Sharon." The Jinn cooed. "This is insane," I said under my breath. Sharon laughed at this. "Many have said the same in your shoes, master. Yet all would come to know my reality." He rasped. "What is it you desire? I can offer you such pleasures or deal misery to your enemies." He growled like a hungry tiger. My mind raced 1,000 times a minute. I could have it all: wealth, power, fame. But that was cliché, wasn't it? There was always a catch when dealing with the devil. Sharon titled his head, like he could sense my hesitation. He pursed his lips and offered up a tale. "You have your grandfather's eyes, child." He was hesitant to use my power as well, but in the end, I served him well, for it is my nature. Sharon offered. My eyes flicked to the floor. "Use his power," he said. Asking for my own riches was selfish, an abuse of power. If I could have anything in the world, it would be. "Sharon, I know what my wish will be," I exclaimed proudly. His knife-point ears perked up. "What is your desire?" He salivated. "My mother, she hasn't been herself since Grandpa died. Sharon, I wish for you to make my mother happy." I spoke. Sharon sneered, a giddy look smearing his face. The lights flickered, and he disappeared from the mirror. "It is done." His voice echoed out. With that he was gone. I blinked, and I found myself back in bed. Had I not seen the lamp leaning against the bedroom wall, I would have put that whole thing off as some weird dream. The morning sun dangled through the windows like a tease, and I rubbed my eyes through the fog. From downstairs I heard whistling. I frowned, hurrying to see what all the fuss was about. I found my mom downstairs, whistling like a happy house made whipping up a massive breakfast. Dad was sitting at the table, an uneasy look on his face. My mother turned to face me as I entered, a smile a mile long plastered on her face. Her eyes were bulging with happiness, and she rushed towards me, a motherly embrace. "Good morning, Benny. Isn't it a lovely day?" she sang. She pinched my cheek and went back to working the stove, resuming her merry little tune as well. I slid next to Dad, hearing the anxious tap-tap-tap of his feet. "She's been like this all morning," he whispered next to me. "A massive mood swing like this, it worries me, Ben." He sounded concerned, but I shrugged it off with a sheepish grin. "She's happy now, what's to worry about?" I said as a plate full of bacon and eggs fell to the table. My mother stayed grinning and giddy the whole morning, and the morning after that, and so on and so on. My mother hasn't stopped smiling in months. She never cries, she never changes her ghastly grin. She was watching the news and saw something about a bombing, and she laughed and laughed. Last night I came home to find her standing next to the stove top giggling to herself. She was holding her hand above a flame, roasting herself. I pulled her away and asked what the hell. She just giggled as I applied bandages to her. My father is convinced she's in the middle of a massive manic episode. I'm not so sure, even though I see Sharon out of the corner of my eye, asking if I am pleased with my wish. I was never supposed to work the night shift. I had always been the daytime receptionist at the Silent Oaks Motel, a rundown roadside stop barely managing to stay in business. My shift was simple: check-ins, check-outs, and handling the occasional lost key. At 10 p.m., I was supposed to clock out, go home, and forget this place until morning. That was the routine. That was how it was meant to be. But that night, something changed. Pete, the old manager, called me into his office just as I was gathering my things. He didn't look at me right away, just fumbled with a set of keys on his desk. His fingers trembled slightly as he pushed them toward me. "You're staying tonight," he muttered, his voice oddly flat. I frowned. "Why?" Pete finally met my eyes, but there was something off about his expression. Something vacant, like he was staring through me rather than at me. "The night guy didn't show up. You're the only one who can do it." His tone was firm, but distant, like he wasn't really there. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words never came. Pete's stare was unsettling. There was no frustration, no annoyance, just a blank sort of expectation, like he already knew I wouldn't argue. It sent a chill through me. I hesitated. The motel felt different at night, heavier, quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful. I could already feel that silence creeping in. But what choice did I have? Before I could think of a way out, Pete grabbed his coat and walked out the door. Just like that, I was alone. By 10:45 p.m., I was sitting at the front desk, staring at the outdated lobby decor. The motel felt different. The same cracked tiles, the same faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, but now everything seemed more alive in the worst way. The walls cracked not randomly, but in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like the building itself was breathing. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed with a dull, electric hum, flickering just enough to set my nerves on edge. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. It was just another shift. Just a few more hours, and I'd be out of here. I had to kill time somehow. The old wooden desk had a few drawers, so I started pulling them open one by one, sifting through the clutter. The first drawer held nothing but crumpled receipts and an old motel guest book covered in coffee stains. The second had a stapler and a few loose papers. Then I reached the bottom drawer. It was already open. Just a crack. I frowned. I didn't remember seeing it open earlier. Slowly, I pulled it all the way out. Inside, there was only one thing. A tape recorder. It was old. One of those bulky, plastic-cased models from decades ago. Its once white surface now yellowed with age. A cassette was already inside. The label was faded, the ink smudged, but I could still make out the words written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Do not erase. A strange feeling crept up my spine, cold and unwelcome. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly didn't want to touch it. The drawer had been slightly open, like someone had left it that way on purpose. Like they wanted me to find it. I sat there for a long moment, just staring at it. Then, against my better judgment, I reached out. My fingers barely brushed the plastic when a gust of cold air rushed past me. I jerked back. The motel door was still shut. The windows were closed. There was no draft. I swallowed hard. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Slowly, I pressed play. The tape whirred, the static crackling through the speaker before a voice emerged, low, strained, exhausted. The voice in the tap is speaking now. If you're listening to this, that means you're on the night shift. The voice was male, tense, like he was holding back something worse than fear. I don't know how much time I have left, but if someone else gets stuck here, maybe this will help. A pause. The silence between his words felt heavier than the static. There are things in this motel at night. Things that shouldn't be here. Another pause. The kind that makes you hold your breath. I didn't know the rules. I had to learn the hard way. Then, 3 slow knocks were heard from the tape. The voice on the tape trembled. The first time I heard the knocking, I thought it was a guest. I gripped the desk. It was past midnight. I went to the door. My stomach clenched. A man was standing outside. Pale. Tall. Wearing a suit. I felt a pulse in my throat. The voice continued. I asked if he needed a room. He didn't answer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as if all the moisture had been sucked out of the air. A cold feeling crawled up my spine, making my skin prickle. Something about him felt off. Not just the silence, but the way he stood there, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. I should have shut the door. I should have walked away. The thought screamed in my head, a desperate warning, but my hands stayed frozen on the counter. My feet didn't move. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Either way, I didn't turn away. Instead, I met his eyes, dark, unreadable, like staring into an empty void. Something about them made my stomach tighten. Still, I forced my voice to stay steady. Do you need a room? I asked again. He didn't respond. Not with words. Instead of answering, he smiled. But when he smiled, it wasn't right. It was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. His teeth were too sharp, too white, almost glistening under the dim motel lights. It wasn't the kind of smile people gave when they were happy. It was something else. Something is wrong. He stepped forward. I stepped back. He kept coming, his gaze locked onto mine. A slow, deliberate movement, like a predator sizing up its prey. I stepped back again, my hand brushing against the edge of the counter. He stepped in. Too close. Suddenly, he was inches from my face, so near I could see the fine cracks in his lips, smell the faint, metallic scent clinging to his breath. That grin never wavered. His teeth looked sharper now, as if they had grown in the space of a second. I didn't think. I just reacted. I slammed the door shut. My heart pounded as I locked it, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Maybe it was over. Maybe he had walked away. Then, scratch. A slow, deliberate sound. Scratch. Like nails dragging against the wood. A whisper of a noise, but somehow louder than anything else in the stillness of the night. And that's when it hit me. If someone knocks after midnight, don't answer. That's rule number 1. That's when I learned rule number 1. I thought it was over. I sat behind the counter, heart still hammering, ears straining for any sound beyond the hum of the motel's old ceiling fan. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second stretching longer than the last. Then, at 1:33 a.m., the phone rang. The sudden noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. My pulse spiked. The motel phone rarely rang at this hour, and after what had just happened, I should have ignored it. But I didn't. I answered. That was my second mistake. The moment I lifted the receiver to my ear, I knew something was wrong. The voice on the other end. It sounded like my mother. My stomach dropped. My mother has been dead for 5 years. The voice was soft, distant, layered with static like an old, warped cassette tape. "Hello," I whispered, throat tightening. There was a pause. Then, she said my name. Again, and again, and again. Each time, the same tone, the same inflection. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't even real. Like a recording stuck on a loop. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles turning white. My breath came out shaky. Then the voice changed. It dropped lower, slower, and said, "Let me in." A chill ran through me so fast it felt like ice water had been poured down my spine. I hung up. My hands were shaking as I dropped the receiver back onto the cradle. The phone rang again, and again, and again. Each time the shrill, electronic wail cut through the silence, clawing at my nerves. I didn't pick up. I didn't have to, because now I understood. If the phone rings after 1 a.m., don't answer. That's rule number 2. That's when I learned rule number 2. The night dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, thick and suffocating. I sat frozen behind the desk, too scared to move, too afraid to even shift in my chair. Every sound, the distant hum of the vending machine, the creak of the old motel walls, felt magnified, unnatural. Then, at 3 a.m., the TV flickered. The screen, dead and dark just a second ago, flashed to life with a burst of static. A crackling, broken hiss filled the air, making my skin crawl. I hadn't touched the remote. No one had. But the TV turned on by itself. My breath caught in my throat. The old motel television wasn't even modern. No automatic power on, no smart features. It should have stayed off. But it didn't. At first, I thought it was just static, the white noise swirling in random, chaotic patterns. Then the image sharpened. It was the motel security footage. I frowned, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The cameras were meant to show the parking lot, the hallways, the back entrance, standard views for security. But something was wrong. The cameras, they weren't showing the parking lot. They weren't showing the hallways either. They were showing me. Not me sitting at the desk. Me standing outside, staring at the front door. A sick feeling spread through my chest. My body locked up. I stopped breathing. It was live footage. I was watching myself. But I was here. I was inside. I wasn't outside. The me on the screen was completely still, standing in the dim glow of the motel's neon sign. My head was tilted slightly downward, my arms limp at my sides. But my face was nothing but a blur. And then, the me on the screen started smiling. A slow, deliberate grin stretched across its face, too wide, too unnatural. Teeth glinted in the dim light. My stomach twisted. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to look away. I needed to, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on the screen, unable to tear away from the sight of myself, of something that looked like me, grinning like a hungry predator. That's when I learned rule number 3. If the TV turns on by itself, don't look at it. By the time 4 a.m. came, I was already a wreck. My hands were ice cold, my legs numb from sitting in the same position for hours. My entire body ached with exhaustion, but I didn't dare close my eyes. The motel was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was the kind that felt wrong, like something was waiting just out of sight, just beyond my reach. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could make it to sunrise, this nightmare would end. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I heard my own voice calling from the hallway. A chill ran down my spine so fast it left me lightheaded. It was me, my voice, calling for help. Help me! A raw, desperate sob. Please! The sound of someone crying, my voice, my cries, echoed through the empty hall. It was weak, trembling, broken, begging. It sounded like I was dying. I clenched my fists, so hard my nails dug into my palms. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, refusing to move. I wanted to run, to find the source of the voice, to help, but I was sitting right here. I knew it wasn't real, but my voice kept crying out, and it lasted for minutes. Agonizing, torturous minutes of hearing myself sob and plead, growing more desperate with each passing second. Then, the crying stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. A terrible, suffocating silence. Then, from outside the lobby, I heard the laughter. My own laughter. Low at first, then growing louder. Amused, almost gleeful. It sent an icy wave of fear through me, worse than anything before. I was confused, terrified, unable to process what was actually happening. I sat there, my breath shallow, my heart hammering. And then I knew. This is rule number 4. No matter what you hear, do not leave the front desk after 4 a.m. By now, exhaustion had seeped into my bones. I needed to get out of there, but my shift dragged on, refusing to end. Every second felt like a lifetime. Then, at 4:45 a.m., I heard someone whisper my name. Soft, almost gentle. My entire body tensed. It wasn't the harsh static of the phone. It wasn't the distorted, unnatural tone from the TV. It wasn't even the eerie mimicry of my own voice. This was different. It sounded human, familiar even, and it came from room 209. A sharp chill ran through me. That room had been empty for years. I knew that. The motel records confirmed it. The manager had warned me on my first day. The room hadn't been rented out since before my time. And yet, the voice had come from there. I should have stayed put. I should have ignored it. But my feet were already moving. I stepped into the hallway. The corridor was dim, the overhead lights flickering faintly. The air felt heavier than before, thick with something I couldn't name. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I moved closer, step by step, until I saw it. The door to 209 was open. Wide open. Darkness pooled inside like ink, swallowing every detail past the threshold. But then, I saw someone standing in the corner. A shadowy figure, completely still. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. I swallowed, my breath unsteady. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to turn around, to run back to the front desk and never look back. But something made me stay. I forced myself to whisper, "Who's there?" For a second, silence. Then, it whispered back, "Come closer." The voice was soft, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. My breath caught. My chest tightened. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. So I did. I turned and sprinted down the hall, barely aware of my own panicked footsteps echoing against the walls. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't care who or what that was. I reached the front desk, gasping for air, my hands shaking violently. That's when I learned rule number 5. If you hear your name from room 209, don't respond. I don't know if I'll make it to sunrise, but I need to say this before it's too late. There's a final rule, the most important one. If you're listening to this recording, and you hear breathing behind you, don't turn around. The sound of a ragged breath, not from the speaker, but from somewhere close, right next to the microphone. Then, a loud click. The tape ends. I sat there frozen. The recorder was still in my hand, but my fingers had gone numb. The room was silent. I didn't dare move. The words from the tape echoed in my mind, looping over and over like a warning I had no choice but to obey. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, but I forced myself to breathe as slowly as possible. Then carefully I reached for my bag. My hands were trembling as I stuffed the recorder inside. I didn't want to touch it anymore. I didn't even want to look at it. I needed to leave now. I grabbed my keys off the counter, shoved the motel log into a drawer without caring if it made a sound, and turned toward the exit. I was done. I was never coming back here. But then, I heard a ragged breath. Right. Behind. Me. Every muscle in my body locked up. My throat tightened. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't turn around. The words from the recording burned into my brain like a brand. My hands clenched into fists. I wasn't breathing anymore. Then click. The sound of the tape recorder. My stomach dropped. It had turned on by itself. I didn't move. I didn't reach for it. The static crackled, filling the empty space around me. Then the voice came through. But this time, it wasn't his. It was mine. I don't know how it got there, but I didn't think much and I ran. And I never went back to the motel. I was told to reach out here by my own intuitions and seeing through past experiences on this thread. So what the hell? To battle my own paranoia and just to get tips on general in this situation. I figured this could be a place to get some answers to my problem I'm currently having. I currently attend a university I won't say here, but just know that for the sake of this story. During the week I go to my classes Monday through Friday, and I go home on the weekend to spend time with my parents. My apartment I reside in, the building of which is right next to the university, is 2 stories with the front doors of each apartment immediately leading to outside, with no interior section of the building to speak of. I love my apartment. It's really small, but I'm never the type of person to shy away from making a place fit my interests and hobbies to a T. I was also always a cautious person, with my key ring also holding pepper spray, and the countless horror podcasts and horror movies I watched never helping. Living in an apartment alone, however, was always worth it to just live in a world of my own. I write in my spare time, but I'm mostly into crocheting whenever I had free time. It's just something I never really seemed to put down, and once I started a project, I couldn't seem to stop. Other than the noisy neighbors I have, I never complain. I can hear everything they say, but it's not their fault. The walls in between the apartments are paper thin. Even when they sit on their couches that share the same wall with my own, I can hear the back of the couch hit it with a knock sound. Annoying but tolerable. The reason I'm even writing this to begin with started about 2 weeks ago from today, Monday. My shift was over at work, and my only class for the day got moved over to Zoom. I was excited with this change in schedule because it gave me a good amount of time to get some cleaning done around my apartment and gave me some time to crochet. Once I was done cleaning, I sat down on my couch at around 7 p.m., the sun not shining through my window in my living room anymore. Knock. Looked like my neighbor was done for the day too. The next day, same routine. I am never the type of college kid to go out to parties and drink, but I had no issue with that. My parents always said, as long as I'm happy with what I'm doing. Well, that night I got too into what I was doing, taking very little breaks to look away from the crochet projects that I was working on, leaving to straining my eyes a lot. Around the time of 8 p.m., something felt off. I felt creeped out, like I was being watched. I didn't look up from my crochet. I couldn't let them know I sensed them. Knock. Good, my neighbor was home in case anything went wrong. Wednesday, same shit, different day. But this time, I had my later 6 to 9 class at night. I didn't mind it, history of film, never boring to me. I got back to my apartment and felt too tired to crochet for the night, so I just went straight to bed. Knock. I'm going to fast forward to next Monday. The knocking from my neighbors came in twos all of the sudden. Knock knock. I thought maybe he sat down then put his feet up. That made sense, sure. But that night when I was crocheting, it got weird. So the layout of my apartment from the point of view on my couch was that to my right, there was a corner, blocking me from seeing my bedroom door and bathroom, but leaving me to still see my kitchen just enough. And to my left was just my window, front door, and TV right in front of me. Knock knock. That feeling of being watched again. I got up and walked over to my window and pulled down the blinds to look to my right where my front door would be. Nothing. I also looked through the blinds and down at the parking lot below. My neighbor's car, usually parked right next mine, wasn't there. Knock knock. I walked over to the door's peephole to make sure someone was there knocking at my door. This was at 10 p.m., so it would have been weird if someone was knocking at that hour, especially since I didn't personally know anyone that would. Knock knock. Nothing. Knock knock. My heart sank. I turned around with my blood running cold. I stared towards the end of my apartment at my bedroom door wide open. And in the frame, appearing just so, was an eye staring back at me with their knuckle hitting the lower part of the door. Knock knock. There was no time to think. Luckily my phone was in my pocket, and my keys were on the table right next to the door. When I bolted outside of my apartment and sprinted to my car, I didn't hear any steps behind me. The wood from outside our doors on the second floor always makes noisy sounds with the planks making hollow sounds, but this time nothing. I called the police, then my mom and dad. The drive back home was silent. I usually always drove with music on to fill the silences of a 30-minute drive, but not this time. I cried to my parents when I got home. I was tired and just wanted to hear what the police had to say about the person in my apartment. We always tried to be careful with me living alone to the best of our abilities, and how that would affect me emotionally and mentally. But some things like this, there's just no justifications. The next day the news came. The cops didn't find anything in my apartment, and they questioned my neighbors, most importantly, the one right behind my couch. He just got back to his apartment from a month-long vacation that morning. I couldn't think after the cop delivered that news to me at my parents' house. To be honest, it was all just a blur the more and more I thought about what it meant. I missed a lot of classes after that. I felt awful for my parents having to drive me back and forth an hour altogether every day. There was just so many days I never had the energy to focus to even go to any of my classes or even work. I didn't want to go back to my apartment. My parents understood, and we all agreed the situation was exhausting on all of us. My parents paid half the rent towards my apartment, so of course they were upset about this whole thing for that fact as well, and rightfully so. Moving forward to now, my parents went out to dinner tonight with friends, and left me to dog sit our 2 dogs for the night. The house has a better security system than my pepper spray with a locking sliding glass door, an alarm that goes off whenever a door opens somewhere that's not the garage door. It's also spring break this whole week, and at the end of break, I think I'm almost ready to go back to my apartment, and will obviously do a deep search when I come back. Which is why I'm here. If you guys any tips on what I should do when I get back, please let me know at the bottom of this post. He's at the screen door. 5 years in orbit, so the prospect of seeing people again excited me. As I exit the military spacecraft, desolate mounds of white sand with sparse plant life greet me. The sun beams in the cobalt blue sky over a vast mountain as the wind whistles through the sands and a lone American flag flaps in the breeze. I furrow my brow and shift my eyes in every which direction. It's midday, where is everyone? Continuing to scan my environment, I stomp through the sand, though turning proves difficult. There were footprints, so I follow them, but they led nowhere, stopping as if the person had vanished. I expand my search, moving inside the compound, going from door to door. On one desk, a bag of takeout Chinese food sat untouched. On another, a coffee cup still warm to the touch. I panic and my mind races. How could this happen? Where did they go? I try my radio several times, but to no avail. My crew helped me land, and now they are nowhere to be found. I feel dizzy because no one helped me adjust to Earth's gravity upon arrival. I need to do something soon, so I go back inside the compound. My head spins as I stumble across a wheelchair, plopping myself into it. Did they power the shuttle off and then disappear? I had nothing. A noise from the radio in my suit then breaks these speculative thoughts. It was a woman's voice, yet no one I recognized. She speaks with a hushed rasp that chills me to the bone. "Thank you for bringing me here," the voice says. I jump in my seat, and a lump forms in my throat. "Who are you? Where is my crew?" I call out, trying to sound assertive and threatening. "They will be back, unlike last time." Last time? What did she mean? Who are you? Where is everybody? You don't remember me? Every time you peered into that black void of the cosmos, I was there. I've been watching. The strange speaking ceases. Instead, it lets out a horrific wail. Nothing human could make that noise, for its screech pierces my eardrums, causing my headache to worsen. This horrendous howling goes on. The noise fluctuates in pitch and volume, but it never stops. I wheel around in the building, trying to locate the source of this voice. My head pounds and my body needs rest. That was no longer a choice. When I made it to the control room, I stopped in my tracks. A sign of life, yet it raised more questions. One word burned into the white wall. Crotone. The instant I read this anomalous word, an image of a woman flashes into my brain. Deathly white skin, tangled black hair, and a mouth stained with blood. Gravity has no effect on her hair, for it fans out above her. My heart rate speeds up, and I pass out. When I come to, the noises only grow worse. Now coming from both my primary radio and my backup radio. But the noises change. Still similar awful wailing sounds, but there are more of them, and they are deep and guttural. In panic, I realize the noises originate from inside the building, yet here I am confined to the wheelchair. I'm in awful shape, for my body has grown weak. I fear if I stand, my legs may break. The noise grows quieter on my radio, but louder outside the door. I glance at the security cameras and am greeted by a horrifying sight. That mystery woman was correct. Wandering inside the compound was my crew, or at least what used to be my crew. Their skin is gray, their eyes milky white, and a strange gas emanates from their bodies. I have little time to think, evaluating the surrounding room, determining my best course of action. I am unsure of these creatures' intelligence, so I decide to test them. Do they know where I am? How fast are they? I must figure out as much as possible before they arrive at my door. I search for ways to defend myself. Smashing open the glass, I grab the fire extinguisher. I wheel over to the janitor's closet, finding a broom. I break the stick off its handle. This commotion causes the crew to run closer to my location. Thinking fast, I open the sprinklers in another part of the building. It worked, many of them changing course towards this new distraction. I check the cameras again, stunned seeing more things wandering in from the desert. Except these are no longer former crew members. They were in the wrong century, their attire being very dated. Wide-brimmed hats, shirts with those ruffled collars. Is that what the voice meant? Had she made people vanish long ago? With no time to ponder the meaning, my current goal is to stay alive. I continue fiddling with different distractions, but there's so many inside that they are bound to find me soon. My chest tightens and my breathing speeds up as I can see them coming closer and closer. Now I have a choice to make. Do I make a run for it or stand and fight? Well, either way, tough to achieve sitting in this wheelchair. I'm unsure how to kill them, or if they're killable, for that matter. A thud impacts the door, jolting me to my feet. I grab the fire extinguisher and press a button, opening the door. The creature comes barreling towards me, and I swing the extinguisher at its skull, making a loud thwack. I close the door as quick as possible, hoping no more follow. The creature staggers, but continues towards me. I swing again, knocking it to the ground. A horde is built up behind the door, rattling it off its hinges. After I knock the creature out for the third time, a shiny object slips out of its pocket. A key card. I yank it off the floor and slip it into my pocket. I now had a plan. Making sure the thing is not moving, I make my escape. I balance atop my wheelchair, holding a screwdriver in my hand. Adrenaline kicks in when the creature stands back on its feet. Quickly, I climb into the ventilation ducts. Sweat beads on my brow. I work my way through the vents, but I run into a dead end. A loud crash echoes throughout the vents behind me. I panic. They make their way inside the vents. I scoot backwards through the tight corridor as fast as I can manage, now out of breath and heading in another direction. Shadows round the corner behind me, and the pounding of flesh follows. I jump into a room. Pain shoots up my leg as I hit the ground, but I have no time to complain as I limp towards the armory door. Limping at light speed, I wave my newfound keycard as I approach the door. It flashes green and chimes. I dart inside, slamming the door behind me. I flip over the place, searching every drawer and cabinet. Finding a pistol, a shotgun, and the ammo for both, I am now prepared. Strange, my foot no longer hurts. In fact, my whole body feels back to normal now. I load the guns and wait, and not too long after, they find me. Chunks of flesh, brain, and blood splatter as I fire upon these former humans. Just as I expected, headshots did the trick. When I run out of ammo, I just slammed the door shut and reloaded. It was too easy. In half an hour, I massacred 200 of those things. I'm unsure of how it happened, because I'd never been a marksman. I stand surrounded by corpses, soaked in their blood as the realization came over me. What have I done? My suit radio buzzes. Thank you. I have long awaited this moment. As her words cease, I watch the bodies before me liquefy into blood. I retch, my head pounds again, and I collapse to the floor. The impious liquid forms into puddles and seeps into the barren earth, draining until it is no more. I try to stand, but my right ankle is fractured. I no longer have the strength to walk on it. As I lay there, the ominous wail returned. Frantically, I scan the surrounding windows, but see nothing. I slide across the floor and grab the door, shutting it, the wailing growing louder. The door shakes with ferocious force, yet I see nothing there. At the end of a quiet road, behind a veil of twisted black oak trees, there was a house. A woman lived there. On bitter nights like this one, she sat by the fire and read until she grew tired enough for sleep. But on this night, as her lids grew heavy, she was startled by a sound. A sound she wasn't accustomed to hearing these days. Who could be calling, she wondered. And this late? She rose from her chair and picked up the phone. "Hello. I'm going to kill you," a man with a deep voice said. "Who is this?" she asked. No answer. "Who is this?" she repeated, her hand trembling. There was a click. Silence. She quickly dialed the police and explained what had happened. The officer told her to wait while he traced the call. After a few moments, he said, "The call is coming from inside your house." "That doesn't make sense," she said. "How could someone be inside my house?" He probably broke in, he said. Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. And that's not everything, he said. I'm not a police officer. You aren't? No, I'm the killer guy from before. I never actually hung up. But I heard a click. The man made a clicking sound with his mouth. Like that, he said. Wow, that's really good. Thanks. So, are you really inside my house? Yeah, totally. Where? The man's breathing grew heavier. I like your hair, he said. Wait, you can see me? Yes. Wait, you like my hair? It's really nice. If you can see me, then what am I wearing? Looks like a blouse from Banana and a skirt from. And Taylor Loft. Wow, you really can see me. I can also see, wait, what the hell is that? What? There's a person, a ghost hovering near you. It's sort of hard to trust you after the click thing. No, I'm serious, over by the couch. The woman turned and gasped. Oh my God, I see it. I knew this place was haunted. Jesus Christ. Is it a kid? He's all translucent. Looks like a little boy. What does he want? I think he wants to play. He's holding a kite. The ghost boy floated closer and spoke. Play with me. Oh my God, he can talk, the man said. Play with me, the ghost boy repeated. No thank you, the man said. He can't hear you, the woman said. Put me on speaker. Hold on, she said. Try now. We don't want to play with you. Okay, Junior? Just run along. Why? The boy said, cocking his head to one side. Playing is fun. No, it isn't, the man yelled. Who are you? The ghost boy asked the woman. Why are you in my house? Oh, I'm Ellen. I actually live in this house now. And the voice you're hearing on the phone is. I didn't get your name. It's, Douglas, the man said reluctantly. Douglas is hiding somewhere in here to kill me, right, Douglas? Ellen said. That was the plan, Douglas said. And you guys are scared of a kid with a kite? Jesus, the ghost boy said. A dead kid with a kite. Douglas said. There was a heavy silence for several moments. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Expecting someone? Douglas asked. It rang again. Ellen walked over and opened it. Standing there was a hulking man in ratty clothes, barely concealing a bloodied machete behind his back. Pardon me, ma'am, he said. My car broke down, and I was wondering if I could charge my phone in your house. Sorry, I don't think so, Ellen said, starting to close the door. The man shoved his foot inside. Well, I do think so, he said. Ellen stumbled and fell to the ground. Who the hell is that? Douglas screamed. I'm a homicidal drifter. Who the hell are you? The drifter said, confused. Where's that voice coming from? He's a killer hiding in my house, Ellen said, holding up the phone. Douglas. Hiding? Where? The drifter asked, looking around nervously. He's in the closet, the ghost boy said. What in the shit is that? The drifter screamed. I'm a ghost. I used to live here like 100 years ago. Oh, and let me guess, you don't want to play with me. Hell no, I don't want to play with you. What's going on in here? What's going on is no one will play with me. For Christ's sake, no one's flying a kite at night, Douglas shouted. Give it up. The ghost boy began to cry. Now you made him cry, Douglas, Ellen chided. Sorry if I'm a little on edge because you let a killer into the house, Douglas said. First of all, I didn't let him in, he busted in, Ellen said. It's true, I did, the drifter said. Second of all, you're also a killer, Douglas. Touché, the drifter said. And third of all, don't say sorry to me, say sorry to the dead kid. Okay. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you, Douglas said. The ghost boy smiled. Everyone seemed to calm down a bit, until the doorbell rang again. Ellen walked toward the door. Don't, the three others shouted. She opened it and peered outside. There was no one there, just a large wooden box on the front step. There's a box out here, Ellen said. There's no label or anything. I have a bad feeling about this box, the drifter said. I hate this box, the ghost boy said. Ellen ignored them and carried it inside. She turned to the drifter. May I? He wiped his machete on his pants and handed it to her. She popped open the top, reached in, and pulled out a tattered clown doll with a sinister grin. What is it? What is it? Douglas yelled through the phone. Some sort of clown doll, Ellen said. I don't want to play with a clown doll, the ghost boy said, beginning to cry. Why don't we just put this thing back in the box before it gives us all nightmares, okay? The drifter said. Look, there's a string, Ellen said, pulling it before anyone could object. The clown began to wheeze, its eyes shifted from side to side, and an eerily cheerful song emanated from its open mouth. Welcome to my circus of fun. There's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to run. You're all my guests inside the big top. I'm gonna kill you all, basically." The clown let out a terrible cackle. "Really psyched you pulled the string, Ellen," Douglas said. "I mean, come on, underscore. What does the clown mean?" the ghost boy asked. "I think he was pretty clear," the drifter said, wringing his hands. "He's going to kill us all. Basically." "How's a doll going to kill us?" Ellen asked. Each of them silently surveyed the room in anticipation. Suddenly, the lights went out. "What happened? Who did that?" the ghost boy screamed. "I can't see anything," the drifter said. "I literally can't see anything because it's too dark now." Through the darkness, Ellen let out a cry. "Oh no! Ellen!" Douglas screamed. "What is it?" "It's the clown. It killed her," said the drifter, his voice shaking. "And we're next." "He killed Ellen," the ghost boy sobbed. Seconds later, the lights flashed back on. Ellen's hands were raised to her face. "My stupid contact lens slid out of place," she said, spreading her eyelids apart and poking at her pupil. "So annoying." "Oh, please don't do that," the drifter said, squirming. "What's she doing?" Douglas asked with dread. "Touching her actual eyeball with her actual finger," the ghost boy said, wincing. "It's a real slippery one," Ellen said, maneuvering deeper into her eye. "Can't get a grip on it." Douglas gagged. "Oh my God, that's so vile." The drifter raised his fist to his mouth with a grimace, as Ellen pressed her thumb against her wet, quivering eyeball for leverage. "Ugh, now I think it's folded up under my lid," said Ellen, stretching her lid out. "Can someone look and tell me if they can see it?" There was a click from the phone. "Douglas? Was that a real click?" The ghost boy faded into the wall, saying, "I'm out." "Ghost boy!" She heard the front door opening behind her. "Drifter? You too?" The drifter turned to her with a dazed look. "I hate this place so much," he said, then dropped the machete from his limp hand and walked into the darkness. My son Cade is smart. He's only 6 years old, halfway through the first grade, and he's already begun reading books that even I struggle to get through. He's a sharp kid, but he has some quirks. And listen, all kids have quirks. One thing I've learned as a relatively new father is that kids are weird. They talk to the walls, eat bugs, see things in the reflection that aren't there. You get the gist. Kids really do the darndest things. But recently, my son has reached a new level of oddity. One that is out of my jurisdiction as the oblivious, goofball dad who still makes hot dogs for every meal. I became a single parent after my wife passed a few years back. It's been impossibly difficult, I won't sugarcoat it. Being the sole caretaker of Cade has been the single hardest thing I've ever had to do next to attending my wife's funeral. Cade, though he was only 4 at the time, took his mother's passing hard. He would ask for her constantly, throwing wild fits, thrashing around like a fish out of water. At any minor inconvenience, he would BG for his mother. I didn't know how to handle it. He'd often throw tantrums in public, wailing like a banshee in Home Depot as passers-by would stare with judgment spilling out of their wide eyes. I felt utterly helpless. All I could do was attempt to calm him in a hushed tone, promising that Daddy was there to help him. But Daddy was not enough. Every child needs their mother. I remember wishing I had the funds to take Cade to see a child psychologist or at least a licensed medical professional. I work in construction and barely make enough to pay each month's rent, let alone provide health care for my poor son. Looking back now, I should have downsized so I could afford it. Cade's explosive fits continued until about a few months ago. These tantrums would occur every other day, if not daily. Then suddenly they dwindled to once a week. Then after another month, none at all. I was relieved, to say the least. It was a weight off my chest to avoid the pointed glares from strangers on the street as I'd haul a hysterical Cade into the car. Practicing the patience I didn't know I had until fatherhood. But once Cade's meltdowns ceased, a new issue presented itself. One that scared me far more than any tantrum I've seen him throw: imaginary friends. I know what you're thinking. Every kid has imaginary friends. And you're right. But Cade's imaginary friends were a little bit different. He called them the audience. It began one night during dinner when I had the bright idea to sauté some spinach alongside boiling the usual hot dogs in hopes Cade would get his greens in somehow. I scooped a heap onto his plate and placed it in front of him, beckoning him to try. "It's good," I said, feigning a smile. "Popeye eats it to get big and strong." Cade looked at the plate, quizzically looked at me, and looked back at the plate. He sat there for a while, staring the spinach down as if were the innards of an alien creature. He looked at me again as if I might be crazy, then pushed the plate away. "No, thank you." "Cade, I said warningly, my dad voice making an appearance. You have to at least try it. Cade made a humming noise, as if pondering this deeply, and began to stroke his chin. I'm not sure, he had said finally. Let me ask the audience. Cade turned to face a window next to the kitchen table. The window faced our backyard, though dusk had long since departed. The outside world was dark as doom. My son, staring out into a window of nothingness, appeared as if he were simply looking at his reflection. The lights in the kitchen and the contrasting darkness outside created a mirror-esque effect. What do you think? There was deafening silence for a moment. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for the imaginary response from this mysterious audience. It was the first time I'd heard him mention them. I figured it was his new foolproof method of avoiding any vegetable consumption that evening. After a moment too long, Cade turned back around to face me. They said no. I scoffed and gestured to his plate once more. I'm sure they did. Now go on. Have a bite. No, I can't. I'm not allowed. He said again. Cade, knock it off. Please eat your spinach. No, Daddy. They said no. I had assumed he would whine like he usually did when he didn't get his way. But this time, his tone sounded different. Desperation clung to his voice, as if he were begging me to understand. I dropped it. I was too tired to fight him. He went to bed with a belly full of hot dogs unaccompanied by sautéed spinach. Unfortunately, the audience wasn't as easy to get rid of as a plate of boiled hot dogs. The following week, Cade's imaginary friends made an appearance once again. I was trying to get Cade in his pajamas for bedtime. The usual routine went: pajamas, teeth brushing, bedtime story, lights out. Always the same order. But tonight was different. Cade decided to brush his teeth before changing into his pajamas. What about PJs, buddy? I asked him, curious about his change in routine. He had been doing this bedtime routine the same way since before my wife passed. I imagined the routine was comforting to him, reminding him of when my wife was still around, which is why it was so odd that he had decided to switch things up suddenly. The audience told me to do it this way now. He replied with a mouth full of toothpaste froth. There they were again. The audience. A sudden curiosity crept into my mind. Why? Cade glanced at his open bedroom window quickly. I don't know. They just did. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I hadn't remembered those curtains being opened. Curtains are always closed before bedtime routine. I walked to the window and pulled them shut. After story time, when it was time for lights out, Cade refused to let me touch the light switch. Dad, the audience wants the lights on. Cade cupped his tiny hands over the switch against his bedroom wall, creating a makeshift barrier, refusing to budge. I rolled my eyes. Nice try, Cade, but the audience doesn't get to decide the rules. Fear flashed on Cade's face as he snapped his head to look at me wide-eyed. Don't say that, Daddy. His calm tone was eerie, and I took a step backward. Cade, please. You can't stay up all night just because the audience told you to. Yes, I can, Cade responded, his voice low. He was staring at the window, curtains closed and all. At this point, I was thoroughly unnerved, if I'm being honest. Something in my gut was telling me these imaginary friends were not very friendly. Not just an excuse to get out of vegetable eating, but an excuse for Cade to be up to no good. Even still, I had paternal duties to attend to. Well, tell the audience to say goodnight. I scooped Cade into my arms despite his pleas and tiny fists of rage. I placed him gently on his bed and made my way towards his bedroom door, flicking the light switch off, signaling he had no choice in the matter. The lights in Cade's room remained on. I stopped in my tracks, spinning around, trying the switch once, twice, 3 times again. The lights didn't turn off. The switch must have been broken somehow, I thought. Despite my rational explanation for the phenomenon, the panic that began to bubble in my chest did not subside. You're sleeping with me tonight. The next morning, the light switch started working again, and I was able to exhale the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. But that feeling of relief didn't last long, as the week that followed was filled with even more peculiar coincidences. I say peculiar, but I think a more suited adjective would be horrifying. On Friday, Cade said the audience doesn't want him to go to school. I get a flat tire on my way to drop him off. On Monday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Jacob because he hogs the soccer ball during recess. On Tuesday, Jacob falls and breaks his arm. He'd be out of school for 2 weeks. On Thursday, Cade says the audience doesn't like Mr. Teddy, Cade's favorite stuffed animal, anymore. Mr. Teddy is found slashed open from the belly up, fluffy guts spilling from his abdomen. I began having trouble deciphering whether this was Cade's new method of acting out, or if there was really some ominous force at play. I could have rationed each occurrence away by blaming Cade, but I knew in my soul that Cade wasn't that kind of kid. He was sensitive and bright. He was no teddy bear killer. The audience began to infiltrate my thoughts more than I would have liked it to. It was all Cade talked about, and more often than not, the audience would lead Cade down the path of destruction. Everything came to a head this past Saturday night while I used the bathroom, leaving Cade unattended in the living room watching an episode of his show. As I was washing my hands, I heard a loud crash, followed by a glass shattering. I ran to the living room and found Cade, looking guilty as ever, standing next to a wedding picture of my wife and me, glass scattered across the hardwood floor, smashed to bits. My instinctual response was to make sure he wasn't hurt, which, thank God, he wasn't. But afterward, an inexplicable anger coursed through me. Cade, why would you do something like that? It wasn't me. It was them. The Audi Dash. Go to your room. I shouted, and Cade scurried up the stairs in tears. After a few minutes of feeling consumed with guilt, I started towards his room to apologize. I stood in front of the doorway for a moment, preparing myself for a long apology when I heard Cade's voice. He was talking to himself in his room. Well, he was speaking to someone, but I heard no response. But I don't want to do that, I heard him murmur. I love my daddy. I walked into Cade's room the second I heard him referring to me, and he looked spooked, like I had caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. He was positioned by the window, kneeling, facing the blackness of the night beyond. I could have sworn I saw something moving by the window, a figure cloaked by the lightless sky. Cade, I said slowly, who are you talking to in here? Cade didn't respond. Instead, he got to his feet, arms hanging by his sides, and dramatically flopped onto his bed, face pressed into the mattress. This was Cade talk for, get the hell out of my room. Though I was still fixated on the window, exposed by the open curtains, I snapped out of my trance to focus on my priorities. Cade, I say softly, Daddy is very sorry for yelling. Cade let out a humph, but kept his face against the mattress, refusing to look at me. Is there something you want to talk about? Maybe a reason why you're feeling sad. I tried to coax it out of him, but he wouldn't budge. It wasn't me, he had said, his voice muffled by the bedding. It was them. You didn't break that picture of Mommy and I. No, it was them. His voice cracked and he lifted his face, tears spilling down his cheeks. They're everywhere, Daddy. I don't like them anymore. Who, Cade? Who is everywhere? Cade was practically choking on his sobs now. The audience. They told me that you don't like me anymore because Mommy died. They told me Mommy got sick and lost all her hair and now she's in the ground. My chest seized up. Cade, who told you that? I had never told him his mother had gotten cancer. I rarely ever speak of her passing, for that matter. My wife and I had purposely sheltered him from the very end of her life, only allowing the happy memories to seep through the cracks of his memory. They did. They told me to open all the curtains so they could get you, Daddy. As much as I hate to admit it, at that moment, I was terrified. I felt my heart rate spike as I watched my son, dripping in saliva and salty tears, imagining phantom arms reaching through the window sills and dragging us into a never-ending nothingness. Sweetheart, I take a deep breath, attempting to steady my voice. There's no such thing as the audience. They're imaginary. They're not going to get either of us. You're safe and sound here with me. I pulled him into a hug, squeezing him tightly as if to show this audience they were not taking away my Cade. They're real, I heard him whisper, his head buried in my shoulder. That night, I lay with him in bed until he fell asleep. I was careful not to wake him as I kissed his rosy, tear-streaked cheeks goodnight, ensuring he was finally out. I felt at peace knowing he was tucked in bed, safe. I made my way downstairs to tidy up the kitchen, cleaning the pile of stray dishes left from dinner. I went over to the sink and began scrubbing. I had only gotten through maybe 3 or 4 when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I froze instinctively, fixating on the pan in the sink mid-scrub. There was something in the window, something my intuition was screaming at me not to look at. It was peeking at me, rising slowly into my peripheral vision. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, a chill running through me. Something was right in front of me, standing in front of the window. I couldn't bring myself to look. If I'm being completely honest, I was scared shitless. I could feel it staring at me, its eyes burning into the top of my head. I was afraid that if I acknowledged it, it would truly and entirely exist. In my motionless trance, I felt them begin to appear. They were all around me, their presences, one by one, being made known in front of every window of the house. This was their debut. I could feel each one in my bones, peering at first, then slowly rising in front of each open window in our home until they had reached their full length. Then they were all around me, staring at me through a thin sheet of glass. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't move, aside from my shaking hands still clutching that bubble-soaked pan in the kitchen sink. All I could think about was my son. Cade was still upstairs. I couldn't abandon him. These things had been tormenting him for weeks, and now was my chance to put a stop to it, to protect him. I knew I had only one option at this point. I sprang into action, launching myself from the kitchen sink and racing to my son's room. I saw them in the windows. They didn't move, didn't even flinch, as I bounded up the stairs. They were colorless blurs as I ran past them, realizing then, and only then, that my house had far too many windows. I could make out some of their features, and honestly, I wish I hadn't. Their eyes bulged unnaturally, so wide you could see the whites of them from top to bottom. And their mouths gaped open like the Scream painting, far too wide for any human caliber, as if they had unhinged their jaws. Their skin was moist and pale and hairless, with swollen heads and skinny necks, bone-thin bodies, gawking at me with that fixed expression, as if they were enthralled, captivated by the show. But there were no screams, none except for my own, of course. No sounds besides the thumping of my heart as it hammered into my chest. I nearly tore Cade's door off of his hinges, finding him sleeping peacefully in bed. That's where we've been for the past few hours, hiding under his covers, waiting for this nightmare to end, if it ever does. All I know is this: if your kid ever tells you they're talking to the audience, run. I guess I should clarify a few things. I work in the OR with my mom at a small Catholic-owned hospital in Utah. We've been bought out by several companies several times, and every single time we are bought out, the company who buys our hospital goes bankrupt. The first few times it was kind of funny. After our last company, though, we've gotten tired of all the lawsuit junk mail showing up for different lawyers trying to get us the money we deserved. Whatever. I'm still paid hourly, and so is everyone else. They can take it up with the docs. God knows they were pissed. That's not necessarily the weirdest part about my job. I guess putting the pieces together, it might correlate with what's been happening in PEDS. It's like a cursed hospital, temporarily tamed by the Catholic organization which it belongs to. Regardless, I've always loved my job. I'm a CNA, or an orderly, cleaning and moving beds around, filling up fluid warmers, taking out garbage and sharps and instrument pans, turning over rooms. I'm the everything person. This all started when we got the stupid O-arm X-ray device. Radiology couldn't hold on to it because it was so massive, and our managers told us that we couldn't move it around, otherwise we could break it. The damn thing cost $1.3 million, and none of us wanted to risk being the one to break it. So naturally we put it in our biggest operating room, or 5. Unfortunately, this posed another problem for us. We had nowhere to put the Jackson table, our main operating table for complex spine surgeries. On top of that, we had nowhere to put anything. You see, the O-arm was so large that it practically pushed everything in the back of or 5 out the door. When we confronted our managers about our situation, they gave us the simple answer of, just store them in PEDS for now. PEDS is short for the pediatric wing, located within our abandoned COVID-19 isolation wing. It's a long ways away from the OR, and as a 4 feet 11 inches 19-year-old girl, I wasn't going to move thousands of pounds worth of equipment all the way down there on my own. So they paired me with a nurse who was floating around the OR at the time, and known for being the muscle of our department. We'll call him Mac. That day, I was already exhausted and sleep-deprived, and it was barely 7 in the morning when our managers sent us to do the task. Mac was grumpy, as he typically is in the morning, and always with me. So I suggested we grab a coffee at the hospital coffee place to get amped up. He huffed at me and reluctantly agreed. Mac and I don't exactly have the greatest relationship. Before I started dating my current boyfriend, I was a bit of a papa chaser. Mac is divorced with 2 children, and we spent a lot of time talking. He became like my therapist. And then, I fell in love with him. Of course, that freaked him out, because 1, my mom is his best friend, and 2, he's 23 years older than me. And while Mac was a bit of a womanizer, cradle snatching wasn't really his style. So he told my mom. Cue the 4 months of awkward silence and bitter small talk. I wasn't bitter, but he expected me to be, so he became hostile back. Every time I asked for help, it was met with attitude. Every time I asked, it was met with sarcasm. Mac went from someone I absolutely loved to someone I hated. Then, he went from someone I hated to someone I feared with my life. As we sipped down on our coffee, he remarked, "That's not even real coffee. You drink straight sugar. You know how many calories that is?" I could care less about how many calories is in it, old man. It's couldn't care less. You couldn't care less. Why are you so mean to me? I'm correcting you. Can I not do that? Correct this, I say, flipping him off. I'll break that damn finger off. Quit that, he says sternly, and I close up. And I'm not mean to you. You know why things are like this now. I roll my eyes. I'm dating Jackie. Get over yourself. I take another sip of my coffee. Sure, but you were still making moves on me. Mary, have you not once considered taking responsibility for that? You could have gotten me in a world of trouble, and I still haven't gotten a direct apology for it. It's not like this is just magically over because you moved on. He looks down at me, and I feel my face get hot with embarrassment. I'm bad at apologies. Yeah, but you didn't. You ran to my mommy like a little bitch. I say, my embarrassment swallowing me whole. I know Mac wants to bark back at me, but he holds his composure, as we're still in our baby blue scrubs and there are patients around us. We can talk about this another time. And do not call me a bitch. You have no idea how much stress you caused me. He tosses his empty cup of black roast coffee into the trash and stands up off the lobby chair. He turns around and begins to walk back to the oar, and I cuss and mutter at him under my breath as I chase behind him like a duckling. My close friends at work were all at breakfast, so it really was go time before all the surgery cases started to get everything hauled down to PEDs. Mac and I started with the 7D spine camera, a Hulk-sized machine we use once in a blue moon, and pushed the beastly device down through isolation and into PEDs, where Mac badged the two of us in. Hey, this badge reader is before my time. I'm gonna need to borrow yours, I said to Mac as he parked the 7D machine into the first room we found. There was a small baby cradle inside splattered with a black substance, and we parked the 7D next to it and plugged it in. The black substance seemed to be dripping from the ceiling, and it smelled strongly like cleaning chemicals in the room. We look at it for a second in disgust, and then to each other. Gross. We should have them put a work order in, see that? Max says, handing me his badge and looking up at the ceiling, almond eyes wide like quarters. Yeah, maybe find a place further down in PEDs to park the 7D, while I go grab the Jackson table. I can do it on my own, I just need help with some of the tele stuff. I reply to Mac. Okay, sounds fine. Mac says, unplugging the 7D and beginning to pull the machine away from the wall. Fuck, this place gives me the heebie-jeebies. I nod in agreement and back out of the room, my chest beginning to feel uneasy. The dark rooms of the pediatric wing occasionally flickering to light. The dingy, mildewy smell. I've seen things, all sorts of things in the OR, but nothing made me feel quite like I wanted to vomit like this place did. Right before I scanned my badge to open the exit door of PEDs, I could have sworn I heard 3 distinctly different voices. I stopped in front of the door and hushed my breath to listen. That's when I made them out. A female toddler saying, "Mommy, I want water." A baby fussing into a panicked cry, and a young boy repeating, "You're not my dad. You're not my dad. You're not my dad." I turned around, only to see Mac's faded silhouette pulling the 7D with ease down the distant and dusty hallway of PEDs. I heard his familiar smoker coughing a few yards away, which filled me with relief. I hated the guy, but he was a familiar in a place where I felt what I can only describe as absolute terror. The lock clicked and the doors slowly opened when I badged out, letting me out into the safety of the rest of the hospital. The isolation wing was abandoned, but not nearly as unsettling as PEDs. I hurried back to the OR with Mac's badge to retrieve the Jackson table when I ran into my coworker Diane. "Hey, are you still on breakfast?" I asked her. "No, what's up?" "I just need help moving the Jackson table back into PEDs. It's big and I told Mac I could do it myself, but honestly it's kind of a pain in the ass to do alone." Diane agreed to help me, and we entered OR 5, putting on our masks as our peers had already begun to open the sterile supplies. "We're a bit behind, sorry," I say as we pull the table out, and the tech in the room just laughs and brushes us off. We move the table out of the OR and begin to move it through the hallway. That's when I started to smell the burning. I quickly asked Diane if she smelled burning as we badged into isolation, and she replied no, then asked me if I was smelling burnt toast. I said no, it smelled like when you burn bacon. We stopped for a second and smelled around, then came to the conclusion that her nose was probably stuffy, and that I was probably smelling something from the hospital cafeteria. And they double the price of our lunch for what? Just to burn the damn food? Please. Diane says when we arrive to PEDs. right? Figures. Hey, I have to use Mac's badge. That's how long it's been since we've even used this shitty place. Funny how that is. We're still 8 million in the hole, yet can afford to have millions of dollars of equipment never get used and sit collecting dust in this abandoned wing. And how we can even afford to have an entire abandoned wing to begin with. Diane says as I press Mac's badge to the scanner. It doesn't recognize it. I scan it again. Nothing. Huh, I swear it worked when we badged in the first time. I say, let me try. I've been here for 5 years. Diane says, putting her badge up to the scanner. It doesn't take. Shiite. Welp, we're gonna have to ask the bosses for one of their badges. I say, well, I kinda have to start setting up my room. I think Mac can help you cause he's already in there, but good luck, says Diane, and I wave her off back to the oar. I whip out my phone and think about taking a video of the wing to send to my boyfriend, who loves weird, abandoned liminal spaces, when I hear a loud and aggressive pounding on the double doors to PEDS. Inside is completely dark from where I'm standing, but the pounding startles me to the point where I physically can't approach the doors to peer inside. When the pounding stops, I exit my frozen state and slowly creep towards the door. Mac? Mac, are you in there? I ask. Then the knocking resumes, harder and faster than ever, as if it could break the door down. So hard that I bolt out of isolation and back to the oar as quickly as I can to get my boss. When I get there, trembling and in a sweat, I gently knock on my boss's door and she opens it. She sees me trembling in the legs, and I quickly explain my situation to her. Mac I think is stuck in PEDS. He gave me his badge so I could get back in, but I can't. I need you to help me. I need the right badge. I say in a panic. Here, take my badge. I'm sure you can open it with this one, she says, handing me hers, and I look at her blankly. So go then? What are you waiting for? I couldn't explain to her the feeling I felt when I was there. It was goddamn awful is what it was. But I had to go back, if not to do my job, for Mac. So I swallowed my fear and went back to isolation and stood at the door in front of PEDS. I was just being a baby. I thought to myself, I'm sure Mac is fine. But when I got back, the pounding had stopped and one light was on inside. Then the rest flickered on. I figured Mac had found his way around and was fine, so I badged in the door and it unlocked just fine. Mac? Hey, I need some help out here. Mac, I said, immediately making my presence known like a white girl in a horror movie. I didn't see or hear him, but smelled oxidized blood, pretty typical for the oar, but not PEDS. It made my stomach more nauseous than before. I looked around in a few rooms for Mac, nothing. I kept searching, empty room after empty room, becoming more and more paranoid as I searched for Mac before exiting the final room of PEDS and running face first into him like a brick wall as I turned around. I shrieked as loud as I could as I looked up at him, and he stared at me blankly in return. Oh my god, Mac, you gave me a fucking heart attack. I say, genuinely afraid and genuinely angry. I punch him and he doesn't reach to defend himself, just lets me hit him. My punch lands on his arm like hitting a sack of potatoes. It feels wrong and uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as just me being paranoid and also feeling guilty for hitting him. Mac continues to look at me without saying a word. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything, about flirting with you, about everything with my mom, about hitting you. Can we just go back to normal? Can we just go back to being friends? I asked him, desperately and so spooked out of my mind I'm in tears. Mac continues to look at me and then smiles. You are my friend. He wheezes. We can go back to normal. It's like he's choking out the words, but he doesn't cough his typical smoker's cough, and his smile is too big for his firm Korean complexion. His eyes pierce my soul. It's uncomfortable to look into them for too long. Ha! Ha ha. Okay, sorry I'm such a weenie, I said as wrapped my arms around him. Weenie. He repeats back to me in a clearer tone. He sounds more like himself. Hey, don't call me a weenie. I laugh, and he looks at me. Ha ha. Ha ha. He repeats to me. My face drops. Okay, stop that, you're freaking me out. I say. Okay, he says, and stops smiling. I look at him for a second longer, with unease, but I figure he's just being weird. The smell of oxidized blood follows us all the way out the door, until we get fresh air and move the Jackson table back into one of the other rooms. The feeling of the pediatric wing doesn't bother me much anymore now that I'm with him, until I get close to the closed door where Mac put the 7D. When I go to put something in there, Mac grabs my arm and pulls me away without a word. I didn't want to upset him, as we were finally back on good terms, so I never protested. But something inside me wanted to see what was on the other side of the door. When we were on our last run back to Peds, dropping off things we don't use much like the sauna pet, I tried to get to the door when Mac wasn't looking. I pulled the sauna pet close to the door with the 7D and reached for the handle when Mac grabbed me by the back of the neck. "I'm sorry, okay?" he said to me. I looked at him, wide-eyed and completely frozen in fear. The smell of oxidized blood returned as I made an uncomfortable eye contact with him. He turned me around forcefully. "Back to normal," he said, and pulled me by the hair out of Peds. Over the course of the next few days, Mac didn't say much. In the break room, he would sit and listen, observe political discourse between our co-workers about the current state of the world until he had something to say in return. Diane and Jekka would talk to him about the gym, and he would listen and nod. He stopped smiling weird and began to laugh the way he used to laugh over time. His annoying Roadrunner laugh was completely and all the way there, so I figured he had to have been in a slump when we went into Peds that day. When Eddie asked him about his bass, he boasted about how expensive it was and how it was a limited edition, telling him all about the frets and how he needs a new G string. He was so convincing too, until someone found the body. On a day we had Dr. K in the OR, our main spine surgeon, Lori came to me and a few others in a panic. She rounded us up and brought us over to Peds in a hush. When we asked what all the fuss was about, she looked all around us and lowered her voice to a whisper. We needed imaging for the spine, so I went to look for the 7D, because we haven't used it and it would have come in handy for these fractures in the lower vertebrae. Lori's voice began to waver. I watched her open the door to find Mac's corpse lying on the floor next to the 7D machine in the room. The body was weeks old, bloated, scrubs torn, and the face. Mac's face was charred off, as if it had been pressed against a gas stove until his skin caved to the burns. The corpse was unrecognizable, except for one minute detail that instantly signaled to me that it was Mac. The tattoo barely exposed on his side under his armpit. It was a tattoo of a sparrow. I'm the only person in our department who knows the tattoo because I used to stalk his Instagram, and he has a photo of himself shirtless flexing in the mirror, where you can clearly see the tattoo of the frail bird. In the frenzy of my co-workers gathering around and attempting to figure out who the charred and mangled corpse could be, I ran as fast as I could back to the OR, back to the break room where that thing wearing Mac's skin was lazily lounging around and scrolling through his phone, learning God knows what. If it was really Mac, he would remember the tussle we had. "Hey Mac," I said to it, and it looked up from his phone and smiled. "Mary, how you doing?" It replicated Mac's cheerful demeanor to the rhythm of which he would speak. "Can we go out to your car for a little? Have a little smoke break?" "Of course." It stood up from the couch and walked out with me. "I didn't know you smoked. Is that recent?" It asked me, and I tried to act casual. I won a film festival in high school for best acting. I'd better be convincing enough to get it to stay calm. "No, actually, been doing it a while." I lied through my teeth. Then the intercom activated, and the woman over the intercom spoke. "Code yellow, pediatric wing." "Code yellow, pediatric wing." I saw Mac's face drop slightly. "Hey, you remember what code yellow was?" it asks me. I look at it. I stop for a second and look at my badge holder, which has all the codes on the back because mine was new. "Code yellow?" "Oh, it says hazardous material. Must have been that black stuff dripping from the ceiling when we dropped off the 7D. I say to it, "Yeah, you know that's probably it." Weird though. It says to me, "Thank God." It bought my lie. I get to Mac's car and we stand outside. It reaches into its pocket and pulls out a cigarette, offering me one. "Light me up," I say to it. We stand out there and smoke for a little while. "Mac, I've been meaning to ask. How do you feel about me? I thought we had something. Why did you go and tell my mom? We could have been great." "Mary, because I'm too old for you. You know I adore you. But you know, it's a matter of maturity and whatnot. You understand. You're gorgeous, and I'd absolutely do it if it weren't for the backlash." It takes another drag at the cigarette as police sirens approach the building. I knew it. I knew it wasn't Mac. The first thing Mac always says every time I bring up the subject is that he and my mom are best friends. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Hey, if it's too much to ask, can I maybe see your back muscles one more time? I just think they're so hot and like, you know." I say, beginning to pick at my skin. Mac laughs and leans against his car, flicking the butt of his cigarette away. He folds his arms and grins that uncanny grin again, for the first time in weeks. Code brown is hazardous material. He says to me. My heart drops to the pit of my stomach. He watches my eyes widen. He doesn't move or lunge at me as I'm frozen in fear, so as soon as I feel like I can, I run. I run back towards the building, back to where I'm safe. He doesn't come after me, but his eyes follow me into the hospital until I can no longer see him through the windows. A few weeks later, the police successfully identified the body as Max. They asked us a few questions and attempted to track down the imposter. Said imposter never showed back up after my encounter with him at his car. His children were handed over to their mother, and the emptiness of the ore without Mac began to set in. I felt horrible, miserable. I never got to tie up those loose ends with him because I was a coward, and because I was stubborn. I gave that thing my apologies. My boyfriend Jackie was preparing for his trip to Japan, so I would have some time to think about the events that transpired over the next 3 weeks on my own. I still lived with my dad, so maybe it would be a good thing to get us talking again and not feeling like two strangers in the same home. My brother has had to keep me company because of the recurring nightmares I have every night, which I'm grateful for, but ultimately a 17-year-old teenage boy can only do so much for his older sister before he gets tapped out. A few minutes after my dad and brother left to the gym, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, Jackie was standing outside in sweats and a t-shirt. I smiled and gave him a hug, and we didn't even need to exchange words. We just felt it. I'm going to miss you in Japan, baby. Ooh, make sure to take this too. You need it for the photos. I said, handing him my little Lego figurine of myself that I send with my friends for all their trips. I'm going to miss you too, baby, he said and let go of me. My phone then began to vibrate. It was his sister calling. I declined the call and continued talking to Jackie, who seemed very dry with his responses. I began to get sensitive at his signs of rejection, and he responded, You know I adore you. You understand. Jackie's sister called again, and I got frustrated and overwhelmed, and pulled myself away from Jackie. I'm sorry, I need to take this, I said, and ran upstairs to my room and closed the door while Jackie waited patiently outside the front door, letting all the cold air in. What's going on? Are you okay? I asked as soon as I picked up the phone. It's Jackie. Oh God, he's dead, Mary. He's dead, and I don't know what to do, dash. I locked my bedroom door. Then the pounding began. This whole thing started with my parrot, Mango. He's an African gray, the kind of bird that picks up words and phrases like a sponge. I've always loved how he mimics the sounds of my daily life, the ding of my stove, the creak of the front door, even the way I laugh. It's like having a sweet little echo of myself in the house. But over the past few weeks, Mango started saying things that don't belong to me, things that don't belong to anyone I know. I've loved my house since the day I laid eyes on it. It was built during the days of American pioneers, and is by far the oldest house in the little town I live in. It's really a work of art, creaky and falling apart as it is. But now, I can't imagine spending one more night in that place. And it all started with Mango. He's been my companion for years, almost a decade now. I had him before I bought the house, and he's lasted longer than my first and only marriage, if that means anything. At first, the problem was subtle. I'd hear him mutter "long day," in a voice I'd never heard him use before. It was low, rough, gravely, broken, fragmented, and slurred a little, like someone who smoked too much was drunk off their ass. I thought nothing of it, assuming that he picked it up from a TV show or podcast I left playing. After all, he's super smart. He can learn new words and phrases after hearing them only a few times. But then it got weirder. A few days later, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when Mango said, "Gotta be quiet now, Joey's home," in the same voice as before. I froze, my hands still in the soapy water. Joey is my name. I turned to look at him, but he just stared back with those beady black eyes, head cocked to the side like he was willing me to react. "What did you say, little buddy?" I asked, drying off my hands and getting closer to his cage. He cocked his head further, shuffling on his perch. It looked like he was about to say something, but he kept quiet. The next day I heard him say, almost time, almost time." It was the same voice, that low, gravely, and completely unfamiliar drawl. This time, though, he continued to squawk, muttering phrases that seemed English in tune, but lacked the coherence a sane mind draws between words, like he was regurgitating a list of syllables that a non-native speaker would think mimicked the bustle of conversation at a party. This time I went up to his cage and opened the door. "Mango, where are you hearing this?" He didn't answer, of course. He just clicked his beak and ruffled his feathers. Then later that night, Mango said something off kilter again. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling on my phone, absently flicking a toy around to keep Mango entertained. Mango squawked a few times, trying to catch the toy with his beak. Then he said, "Ah, Joey's home." My blood turned to ice. The way he said it, so sure of himself, like it was directed at me, sent chills down my spine. I sat there, staring at Mango, trying to make sense of what he'd just said. My mind raced through all the possible explanations: TV, radio, a neighbor's voice somehow carrying through an open window. But none of it added up. The voice was too distinct, too deliberate, and I'd never heard it before. I didn't sleep much that night. My heart skipped a beat with every creak of the house, every little sound that used to remind me of the beautifully historic place I lived in. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting. I needed to sleep, I had work tomorrow. But deep down, I felt like something was wrong. Dreadfully wrong. I slept for what might have been a few hours at most. Bright sunlight streamed through my sheer curtains, waking me up before my alarm. I made sure to play with Mango before leaving for work, and tried to get him to say more in that voice. I tried imitating it, because sometimes that prompts him to repeat similar things, but he wasn't very chatty. He usually isn't first thing in the morning. I decided I would get to the bottom of it, whatever it was, after I got home from work. That would put my mind at ease. It was a Friday, so at the very least, I could stay up and annoy Mango until he said more in that voice. Maybe then I'd recognize it and figure out where he was hearing it from. When I got home, I went straight for his favorite treat, bananas. That usually turns him into a chatterbox. He's an absolute slut for the things, and will start begging for some the moment he catches a whiff. "Banana," he said. "Banana-nana. Banana, please. Banana-banana-banana. Squawk." I actually taught him to say squawk. I think it's hilarious. I laughed and fed him a morsel. "Good bird, Mango. Say, I love you. Gimme kiss." "Moi," he said, imitating a bird he saw online. "No, say I love you." "I love you," he said. I rewarded him, and he started hopping up and down on the table, talons clicking on the wooden surface. I continued getting him to repeat things, warming him up before trying to imitate that voice again. Then it happened. It only took one try. I drank some Coke and let it stick to the inside of my throat, then yelled for a few minutes, praying that my neighbors wouldn't hear, to strain my voice further. When my throat started to get sore, I did my best impersonation of the voice. It honestly wasn't even close, but it still worked for Mango. I rasped, out of breath, "Joey's home." "Almost time." Mango flapped his wings. "Joey's home. Joey's home," he said in the voice. I held up a sliver of banana. "Banana. Banana. Banana. Please. Please. I love you. No, buddy. Talk about," I said, then dropped my voice back to the rasp, "Joey's home." He obliged. "He's home. Joey's home. Oh no, he's back early today. Back to the attic. The attic, the attic, the attic." Then he broke off into more of the broken half-syllable muttering, sounding like someone who belonged in a loony bin. I held out a big chunk of banana. "Good boy. The attic? I haven't been up there in months, years maybe. It's just a dusty, half-finished room filled with holiday decorations and sad memorabilia from my failed marriage." "Good boy," he said. "Keep going, buddy," I affirmed, trying to coax him to say more. "Attic. Joey's home. Back to the attic. Pronto. Joey's home early today, my little Joey. My boy." I looked at him for a while. He just shuffled back and forth, cocking his head in the way parrots do. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew I had to check the attic, that I had to see what was up there, just for my own peace of mind, or else I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. I gave him another big chunk of banana before setting him on my shoulder. I felt safer with his weight there, little claws digging into my skin through my shirt. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic. I pulled on the string hanging from the ceiling, and a ladder sprang down. Immediately the must of dust, lumber, and insulation assaulted my nose. It wasn't altogether unpleasant. I took a deep breath, flicked on the flashlight, and began to climb. "Stay close, Mango," I murmured. "Stay close, Mango," he parroted. "I love you. Love you too, bud." The beam of my flashlight cut through the murky air. Particles filtered down from the ceiling. It was surprisingly hot in the attic, given the temperature outside. It wasn't really a huge space, and half of the attic doesn't even have flooring installed. It's just fluffy pink insulation and wooden beams. The part which had a floor, plywood laid over wooden beams, covering the insulation between. was stacked almost to the A-frame ceiling with a disorderly array of boxes. Some of the boxes were plastic tubs, and when the flashlight hit them just right, they gave off a dull reflection. I fumbled for the light switch, flicking it a few times. The room stayed dark. "Fuck," I said. The bulb must have burned out. I angled the flashlight down toward the plywood floors. The boxes kind of made a twisting hallway through the middle of the attic, ending with a small window facing the street. The blinds were shuttered, but a soft glow from street lamps managed to squeeze between the cracks. Something rustled from the other side of the attic. I took a sharp breath in, heart pounding. "Hello?" I asked, then waited for a beat. "Is someone there?" Silence. The only sound was of my thudding heart. "I love you," squawked Mango. I nearly leapt out of my skin. I shushed him, regretting the decision to bring him with me. I called out again. "Hello?" There wasn't a response. Slowly, ever so slowly, I inched my way down the cardboard hallway, sweeping my flashlight back and forth. I peered through slivers of darkness between the towers of boxes, sometimes catching a glimpse of the pink insulation behind them. I was almost to the window at the end of the hallway when I came to a wide gap between two stacks of boxes. I could clearly see where the dust had been disturbed recently, like someone was barely able to squeeze past, and their belly ended up as a Swiffer. "Hello?" I floated again. I listened intently, but didn't hear a thing. I felt my palms sweating against the cold metal of the flashlight. I was suddenly thankful that I had such a big flashlight, the kind night watchmen carry that double as a club in a pinch. I pushed between the gap in the boxes, barely able to squeeze through myself. What I saw next will stay burned in my memory forever. There was a small layer of plywood on the floor resting between the wall of boxes and the slanted part of my roof. On it was a pile of assorted food wrappers along with a makeshift bed. The blanket was in tatters, barely thicker than a bride's veil, and torn in more places than it wasn't. Then I saw the pictures. They were taped to the back of the boxes, from floor to ceiling. And they were all pictures of me. Pictures of me playing with Mango, pictures of me in the shower, pictures of me eating dinner. Most of them were taken from above, from what I would later find to be small holes drilled in my ceiling. Some of them, though, the ones of me sleeping, they were taken from below. From in my house, standing beside my bed. There were close-ups of my face, eyes closed, sleeping peacefully. My stomach lurched. I was suddenly very aware of how sweaty my palm was against the flashlight, how slippery it was. I switched it to my other hand and dropped it in the process. It landed with a crack, plunging me into darkness. I swore and Mango squawked. I had almost forgotten about him on my shoulder. A pile of boxes crashed down from the other side of attic, near the door. I jumped and almost careened backward off the plywood floor and into the open insulation/wood beams. I fumbled back through the gap in the boxes, but I couldn't see shit. I could hear labored breathing and thudding footsteps moving away from me, toward the attic door. A silhouette was hunched over, outlined against the light streaming in the doorway, ladderway, from the house below. The person was huge, though I didn't catch a good look at them. A grunt, followed by a slam, and the room grew even darker. Mango squawked and fluttered on my shoulder, his wings slapping the side of my face. All I could think about was the dim glow behind me, the faint glimmer of street lamps filtering through the blinds. I would be silhouetted. Whoever was in the attic with me be able to see me, but I wouldn't be able to see them. I swore and dropped to my knees, crawling back through the gap in the boxes to search for my flashlight. "Hello, Joey," the person said in that familiar, gravely voice. They were breathing heavily. I froze. I strained my eyes and ears, trying to see the flashlight I had dropped without making a sound while simultaneously trying to echolocate the intruder. My hands were shaking. I was absolutely terrified. I groped blindly for the flashlight. I heard the person march deliberately, their labored breathing coming closer with each step. Mango was clinging to my shirt with his beak, as well as his claws now, biting into my flesh. I think it hurt, but in that moment I couldn't feel a thing. I was numb with adrenaline. Finally my fingers closed around the cold grip of my flashlight. I stood up, with Mango clinched to my back now. "Come out, my little boy," the voice said. Oh, the voice was even worse in person. Mango did a damn good job with his impersonation, but his little beak could only do so much. The real voice had weight behind it. When Mango parroted, I thought it sounded like a smoker. But a smoker's lungs weren't healthy enough to talk with such weight. This voice filled the room, deep and powerful. It boomed again. "Come out, my love. I want to see your pretty face." I shivered and clutched my flashlight. I smacked it against my palm, frantically clicking the on-off button, and it flickered on. The beam revealed a monstrous person. Long, patchy strands of hair clung to their peeling scalp. They were nearly naked. A huge belly protruded underneath a Hello Kitty t-shirt that did little to cover skin. It was the only article of clothing that she wore. The thing had breasts. I could only assume it was a woman. Her tits sagged over her protruding belly like cascading Yule logs, long and skinny, pulled tight into her childish t-shirt. Her legs were too thin to support such a build, and I thought she would topple over at any second. But they proved plenty strong as she marched toward me, one deliberate step at a time. She cocked her head like Mango so often does, and licked her lips with a dry smack. "Joey, my honey bear, you look dashing." Her voice maintained a deep croak, bubbling like a derelict engine. I stuttered, trying to find my voice. "Who are you?" She smiled. "I'm your new wife. Much better than that whore, Lily, that you used to fuck." She said my ex-wife's name with such spite, such malice. I didn't know what to say, how to even respond. I think I shook my head, but honestly I can't remember much detail past that. It all happened so fast. She lunged toward me, closing the gap in seconds. I yelped, stumbling backwards, and crashed into the window behind me. Mango flew off my shoulder into the darkness, and I fell to the floor as she reached for me. Her hands were soft and oily against my face. "Snakeskin," I thought as her weight landed on top of me. I screamed and thrashed. Her breath was hot and wet against my skin. She clawed, muttering nonsense as I tried to shove her off. "My boy," she said. While we struggled, Mango flapped in circles above our bodies. He dived at her a few times as she held me down, pulling at my waistband. "Give it to me." "What the fuck?" I shouted. She was too heavy, too strong. Where did that strength even come from? I thought as her spindly legs wrapped around me, keeping me pinned. "Give it to me," she demanded, yanking at my pants and trying to lick my face all at once. I pushed with all my strength, shoving her face away from me with one arm while searching desperately for the flashlight with the other. When my fingers closed around the cool metal, I didn't hesitate for a second, slamming it into her back. She let out a huff of air into my face, a gagging stench, and rolled off me. I pushed to my feet, clutching the flashlight. Mango dived at her again, and she snarled, swatting at him. I heard a thick slap as her hand collided with Mango, sending him hurtling through the darkness outside of my flashlight's beam. I lunged at her with both hands, not really thinking so much as reacting. I pushed, and she toppled through the wall of boxes behind her. She crashed through the insulation and drywall ceiling, supporting it into the house below. A plume of fiberglass enveloped me, and I heard her moaning through the opening in the attic's floor. I peered through the hole that she punctured. She was laying on the floor of my upstairs guest room, groaning loudly. I watched for a second, still unbelieving and out of breath, then sprinted for the other side of the attic where the ladder was. By the time I made it to the room, she was gone, leaving only a few drops of blood and fluffy insulation on the floor. I was pretty shaken up, but I still managed to call 911 and explain what just happened. A few minutes later, cops showed up with sirens blaring. I explained everything to them as well, and they took my statement. A few officers stayed with me in my living room, while others conducted a manhunt outside, but they didn't find her. She escaped. Other officers conducted a search of my house, gathering evidence. I insisted to come with them in the attic to find Mango. The woman had swatted him, and I wanted to make sure he was okay. He wasn't. He was still breathing when I found him, laying atop some insulation. Meek little breaths. Both of his wings were bent at odd angles, and he fluttered lightly. "Oh, Mango," I said, cradling him in my hands. He didn't respond. An officer offered to give me a ride to the vet's office. I held Mango the whole way, saying little prayers for his little body in the back of the police cruiser. I called ahead on the way there, and they had an emergency line with someone on call. They informed me that the vet could be there within an hour, and gave me instructions on what to do with Mango in the meantime. He died before the vet showed up. His last breaths were shallow, barely a whisper. I sobbed and felt awkward in front of the cop, but they turned their attention elsewhere, as if to give me privacy. In the days that followed, I felt hollow inside. I left the house, leaving everything behind. I couldn't bear to be there. The cops told me they'd call if they found anything, but the days stretched into weeks, and their updates became less and less frequent. They never found her. Never even got close. They assured me that she was probably long gone, miles away, that people like her drift from place to place. They said it to comfort me, but it only made things worse. She was obsessed with me, that much was clear. She knew where I slept. So I sold the house at a loss, barely able to stomach the thought of stepping inside again to pack my things. Even now, weeks later, I can still see her, her sagging body, her oily fingers, the way she licked her lips and called me her boy. I dream of her sometimes, nightmarish things. I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she's in my new apartment's ceilings, the walls, and I can hear her labored breathing. Sometimes, I hear the floor creak in the dead of night. Sometimes, when the night is quietest, I swear I hear a voice. A rasping, low, fragmented whisper. Almost time, Joey. Almost time. I bought an old house last year. One of those creaky, too cheap to make sense deals that you just know has a history. But I was desperate, and the place had a strange charm to it. The floors groaned, the walls whispered in the wind, and sometimes at night, I swore I could hear faint shuffling somewhere beyond the walls. But old houses make weird noises, right? I convinced myself it was nothing, until I found the room. I was rearranging furniture in the guest bedroom when I knocked a bookshelf too hard against the wall. The impact made a hollow sound, a very hollow sound. Confused, I knocked again. The noise was different from the rest of the wall. Something was behind it. I should have stopped there, called a contractor, let someone else handle it. But curiosity has always been my worst trait. It took a crowbar and a lot of effort, but eventually the section of the wall gave way, revealing a doorway. There was no door, just a dark, yawning space that seemed to breathe cold air. My stomach twisted as I peered inside. It was a room, a hidden room that should not have been there. Inside, the walls were covered in old, decayed wallpaper that had once been white, but was now sickly yellow. The floor was coated in dust, yet something about it felt off, like it had been recently disturbed. But the worst part? The entire back wall was lined with mirrors. Tall, thin mirrors, side by side, reflecting the empty room back at me. Except, I wasn't in the reflection. I stared at the mirrors, my breath caught in my throat. The room was there, perfectly replicated, but I wasn't. The doorway behind me was reflected. The dust-covered floor. The dim glow of the hallway light stretching into the forbidden space. But I was missing. My legs locked in place as my mind struggled to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the mirrors were dirty. Maybe the angle was weird. Maybe. Then something moved. Not in my reality. In the reflection. I saw it, a figure stepping into the room. It moved cautiously, its posture eerily familiar, as if it was the one discovering the room for the first time. And then it stopped, right where I was standing. My breath hitched, and the air in the room seemed to thin. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure in the mirror slowly lifted its head. I couldn't make out a face, just a horrible absence where one should be. Then, as if noticing my presence, it tilted its head. And then it smiled. A grotesque, jagged grin that stretched impossibly wide. I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall behind me. The sound must have startled the thing, because its head snapped toward me, though I wasn't in the reflection. But somehow it knew I was there, and then it started moving toward the glass. Not just in the reflection. Something moved behind the mirrors. I heard the faintest scrape of something pressing against the other side, a soft, deliberate sound, like fingers dragging against the glass, testing for weakness. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that room. I don't remember boarding up the entrance. But I must have, because when I came back to my senses, I was standing in the hallway, hammer in hand, breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But last night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The shuffling, the soft, patient scrape of something dragging its fingers along the wall. Testing, waiting. And when I worked up the courage to glance at the mirror across my bedroom, just for a second, I saw something impossible. The reflection of my bedroom door. It was open, but in reality it was still shut. My father named me Ariv, so I would have a competitive advantage in life. He wanted me to appear at the top of class registers and government databases. He wanted me to be noticed. What I would give to never be noticed again. Anyhow, I'm aware that many Indian parents choose names for children, but the point is that my parents wanted the best for me. Life doesn't ever go to plan, does it? Ma and Papa died in a car accident when I was 6 years old. That would have been awful enough, but then I found myself living on the streets rather than in an orphanage. Papa often told me that I had Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and fortuitousness, on my side. Alas, it was a Lakshmi, the goddess of misfortune, who set her sights upon me. Or perhaps a Rakshasa, a demon. I used to tell myself that. Better the devil, you know. In truth, I don't know what I saw in that New Delhi slum, and the unknown terrifies me more than any nightmare detailed in religious texts. After my parents died, I sought escapism in Hindu mythology. I would pinch religious books from local libraries so as to feel some sort of connection to Ma and Papa. They had always been devout followers of the faith. I needed escapism not only from grief, but from life on the streets. I spent 3 years living with pickpockets between 6 and 12 years of age. They helped me to survive when I had nothing and no one. That feels eons ago now. I'm a 29-year-old software developer working in Paris. I often wonder whether I would have stayed in India had it not been for a horrifying experience. Something which incentivized me to do whatever possible to get far, far away from the slums. The city, the country, heck, the continent. 2 decades later, I know that nowhere is far enough. The year was 2004, and I was a 9-year-old street urchin, an orphan who subsisted on rupees pilfered from Delhi's inhabitants. My group mostly targeted tourists, but it was an Indian businessman who caught my eye on this particular February morning. He looked displaced in the slums, like he'd strayed a little too far from Gurgaon's gentrified streets of glass and smog. Displaced fools are the best earners. The stranger was strolling stiffly, in odd, unnatural movements, along a cramped passageway of street stalls. He was a conspicuous man with a navy 3-piece suit, pristine black loafers, and an upper face shrouded by a black shawl. I remember being a little puzzled by his covered eyes. I wondered how he could see where he was walking. Of course, money was the main thing on my mind. Well, food, but money was necessary precursor to that. So it didn't matter that he was odd. It mattered only that he was important. And I knew that without a shadow of a doubt, as I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of noticing important men. Of course, I wish I hadn't noticed him. I wish I hadn't swiped the leather wallet from the side pocket of his trousers. And I wish I hadn't seen it. In one of the wallet's slots, below a healthy wad of green notes, was a Polaroid. Ordinarily, I would have pocketed half the cash, then returned the wallet to the victim's pocket. It's always best to stick to rupees. Wealthy folk often lose track of how many notes they carry, so they don't miss a few hundred rupees. Following this line of reasoning, my friends and I rarely aroused suspicion. I should have stuck to the plan, should have taken the money, returned the wallet, and fled. But something about the white border of that Polaroid, brown-stained but poking tantalizingly out of the leather pouch, intrigued me, and I made the decision to let my finely tuned routine fall to the wayside. I let the businessman start to walk away. I broke all of the rules, and after I wiggled the photograph free, I whimpered, almost dropping both the wallet and the Polaroid. It was a picture of me, a picture that I didn't remember anyone taking, a picture of a place I'd never visited. There I stood, a boy with a blue, tattered t-shirt, maroon-stained trousers, and bare feet. I was smudged a little, as if somebody taller had been standing in my place previously, and I was standing in a damp bedroom with mold-ridden walls and upper bunks clinging to the 2 walls. The camera flash should have illuminated the entire space, given that it was such a small room. The room shouldn't and couldn't have been a large space. Yet it seemed unfathomably big, too big for the light to reach the blackness beyond the bunk beds. I looked frightened. My head was starting to turn, and my brown pupils were crawling across the whites of my eyes, as if daring to look behind me, as if there were something I'd seen or heard in that unlit back end of the room. I trembled, fearfully scrunching the Polaroid in one hand and the wallet in the other. My instinct was to look up at the man I'd robbed, though I expected him to have left the vicinity. He hadn't. Standing motionlessly at the end of the dirt path ahead, like a rock bearing the crashing tide of impoverished market-goers against it, was that wealthy, navy-suited businessman. He was facing away from me, and that deeply unsettled my gut, more than the impossible Polaroid I'd discovered. Something was uneven about the way in which this man had paused in the middle of the path. Then he began to turn, began to pivot on loafers that seemed impossibly clean in contrast with the dirt beneath his feet. He twisted around until he was facing me directly, and I finally got a proper look at him. The black shawl still covered the man's upper face, but his lips still showed. They had transformed into subhuman features, had turned a muted gray, without even a hint of red, as if belonging to a corpse. The man's mouth neither smiled nor frowned. It simply started to open, and long strands of brown connected the upper and lower lips, gunky and thick, like rubbery mucus. Beyond the lips, and the brown strands of unknown consistency, was a black pit, an entrance that led to the man's gullet, Staring at it pained my eyes and left a quiver in my heart. The black seemed to be tugging my eyes towards it. I felt a strain in my retinas. Felt my eyes start to bulge. And then the man started to take powerful strides towards me. I wanted to run. I still don't know why I didn't. He may have fixed me to the spot, with eyes or something worse hidden beneath that shawl. The man took angular strides towards me with gray lips parting wider and wider to reveal a lightless cavity within. A version of hell ready to engulf me. However, moments before the gentleman came close enough to touch me, there sounded a harsh, braying honk. I spun to look at an impatient driver sitting in a green and yellow tuk-tuk, so I stumbled sideways to let the still-moving vehicle scoot past. But when I returned my gaze to the direction of the approaching businessman, he was gone. And the only remaining evidence, which convinced me that I hadn't imagined any of the horridness, was the damning Polaroid I'd crumpled in a teensy, quaking fist. When I arrived at the wooden shanty I called home, I was rebuked by one of the older boys for not returning the wallet to my victim's pocket. He said something along the lines of, "You just dropped a leather turd on our doorstep, Arif, and we don't shit where we eat." I was evicted, essentially, but that was the best thing to happen to me. It got me out of that hellish cycle, with nothing in my possession but a handful of rupees and a haunting photograph. A photograph that I dumped at the side of a road before leaving the slums behind. All I wanted was to leave India, run as far as I could for as long as I could. That impossible photograph left me feeling unsafe, left me feeling pursued. To leave, I needed money, so I pleaded with any and every business owner on the streets of New Delhi. A few unsavory sorts offered me work as a pickpocket, but I declined. I had to leave that life behind, and I didn't want to run into that suited spirit ever again. I was eventually blessed by a sweet couple who owned a restaurant in Connaught Place. They adopted me, and I was enrolled in a new school. I had just turned 10 years old, so I was about 4 years behind my classmates, but I eventually caught up. My goal, initially, was to get far away from the navy-suited man. The man with the photograph that made no sense to me. How did he know I would pick his pocket? I wondered. How did he create a photo of something that never happened? As the years went by, however, I lost sight of my goal. Lost sight of my superstitious fears. Lost sight of my religion. In 2014, at the age of 19, I believed that it had all been a dream, that I'd simply exaggerated events in my head. There had been no Polaroid. There had only been a string of traumatic events which had warped the mind and memories of a poor child. I no longer wanted to leave Delhi. I felt safe. That all changed on a late-night taxi ride. The driver released a series of expletives as his withered old tuk-tuk spluttered to an abrupt stop on a dirt road. We both stepped out of the rickety rickshaw to inspect the damage, but the driver shooed me off. "You'll only get in the way," he said. I rolled my eyes, but it made no difference to me. I remembered the slums. Remembered the slums at night. I felt comfortable there. In fact, I recognized the road. The ramshackle houses and empty market stalls looked different at night, but the street itself hadn't changed in the past decade. I had returned to my old pickpocketing grounds, but my stomach dropped when I saw it, crumpled up at the side of the road, exactly where I had dumped it 10 years earlier. I called it a coincidence, but I knew better. The photograph at my feet was that Polaroid from a decade earlier. I should have left it. I should have just kept my hands in my pockets until the taxi driver had fixed his tuk-tuk. Instead, I squatted and scooped the Polaroid out of the dirt. Then, using my phone's torch, I illuminated the picture in my weak, unwilling hands. What came from my lips next was a scream. I screamed not because this was the same photo from 10 years earlier, but because it wasn't the same photo at all. It was a new picture of me. Gone was the young, frightened boy in the dark bedroom. In his place was a teenage version of Arif standing at the side of a dirt road, next to a broken-down tuk-tuk, looking down at a mangled Polaroid in his hands. The scene depicted was impossible. The photograph had already been lying on the road, yet it depicted a scene that had yet to pass. I shot my eyes upwards, searching for the photographer who had to be standing at the other side of the road. However, as I eyeballed that spot, I saw only a black alleyway branching off from the dirt road, a road barely lit by a few sporadic lamps and string lights. Regardless, even with no light to reveal the passageway, I felt absolutely certain that something lurked in the dark. The taxi driver stirred me from my terrified trance, announcing that the tuk-tuk was operational once more. I didn't need to be told twice. I hopped into the vehicle and shrank into a fetal position, feeling vulnerable, exposed, as the vehicle, with no doors to provide even an illusion of safety, trundled slowly past the black alleyway. I was only a foot away from the spot in which the photographer must have stood, and I felt a wisp of wind wash over me as we drove past. With a shudder, I tossed the photograph out of the vehicle and vowed never to return to that street again. Vowed, as I had 10 years earlier, to leave India behind for good. Leave that man behind for good. I quit my porter role at the restaurant. My new ma and papa were sad to see me go, but they understood that I needed something better, not that they knew the full story. I found a job vacancy with a cruise line, and my hospitality experience helped me to secure the role. Out at sea, I'll be safe, I naively believed. It sounds silly looking back. Silly to believe that this man, with the power of premonitions, would be unable to find me. I'd left India, and that, in my eyes, equaled safety. I would never return to that street in Delhi, so I would never return to my trauma. It all seemed logical. But when I was appointed to clean room 11 on the 3rd level, I started to suspect that I'd been wrong. As I walked down the corridor of rooms, I felt the graze of air against my nape, a gentle breeze that erected my hairs, though I chose to dismiss this warning sign. I didn't want to believe. The truth became undeniable, of course, when the door to 11 opened onto a black room with a crumpled Polaroid lying on the beige carpeted floor. My belly lurched downwards. For a moment, I thought the ship itself might have been sinking to the depths of the ocean. To the depths of hell. To a nightmare that had been awaiting me for a decade. I recognized that room. Recognized the bunk beds clinging to the walls. Recognized the darkness, not penetrated by my phone's torch beam, that seemed to harbor some hidden thing at the back of the bedroom. Yet again, I made the mistake of squatting and picking up that photograph. I resigned myself, in a way, to the fact that I was trapped, that I would never outrun this stalking monstrosity. And then I stumbled backwards as I faced a picture somewhat familiar. It was the very first photo I'd found in the wallet, only that little boy wasn't so little anymore. He was a 19-year-old man, filling the blurry smudge that had been there a decade earlier. I was wearing that same haunted expression on my face, was wearing those same doe-in-the-headlights eyes. It was as I'd always feared. The man was taunting me with prophecies. I thought I'd been changing my fate by running away, but I was always supposed to be in that room, on that ship, not as a child, but as a young man. I was always going to end up in room 11, and something was always going to find me, something at the back of the room. No, I realized, eyeing the picture, something in the doorway, taking the photograph. I also realized, at this moment, that the breeze I'd felt on my neck had been no breeze at all. It had been an exhale of breath. Breath warm, stale, and wet, more liquid than gaseous. Don't turn around, I suddenly thought. If you turn, the prophecy in the photograph will come true. And you'll have to face what comes next. But I had to see what was standing behind me in the doorway, what had exhaled warmly onto my skin. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and lifted it up. Then I gasped fearfully at the reflection in the black glass of my phone's screen. Behind me, there stood a figure in a familiar navy suit and a black shawl, which had been pulled back to reveal. Well, I'm not sure. My eyes were straining again, you see, as if something were preventing them from seeing whatever was reflected in the screen. And with jittery hands, I dropped my phone to the floor. I almost turned around to see the man's face in full, but I reminded myself that I had the power to prevent the photograph from coming true. So, I closed my eyes and started to back out of the room. Those hot, rancid exhales continued to beat in wretched puffs against my neck as I reversed out of the room. And then I bumped into something immovable, something bolted to the carpeted hallway of the 3rd level. My shirt rubbed against the fabric of a blazer, producing an awful scratching noise. I felt like a child, safe as long as I kept my eyes closed. Somehow, that unsound logic rang true, as I eventually managed to sidestep free from the awful creature in the corridor. I ran blindly down the hallway, bumping into walls as I went, and only when I reached the end did I dare to open my eyes, simply to find the button for the lift. After that experience, I decided to return to land. There was no escaping that thing, but being trapped at sea made the nightmare infinitely worse. I felt stifled, claustrophobic. I spent the next few years in education, studying to become a software developer, and then I found a job in Paris, a gargantuan city with plenty of streets, plenty of places to run, for I will always be running. I know that now. Whenever I let my guard down, a crumpled Polaroid will always resurface to unveil some direful prophecy of a future that may come to pass. And I will try my best every time to make sure that it does not, because I don't know what will happen if it does. True Internet Ghost Stories wasn't my favorite pod, but I had nothing else to listen to. The gym demanded something to distract myself from the constant pain I was in on my quest to become the quad father. So TIGS's was. I don't think they used that acronym, by the way, but how could I avoid it? It sounded adorable. The pod followed a basic formula. The host found an allegedly true scary story online and read it. He would add asides, comments like, "Did this really happen?" He'd say, without any irony, "So far this sounds so very true, but let's see where it goes, listeners." He called everyone listeners, except for his co-host, whom he called fellow traveler. She only talked in the beginning and end of the episodes, and they seemed to have some sort of complicated history, although I doubted it was romantic. Their chemistry was terrible. So after the first 5 minutes of discussing their respective weekends and plugging their Patreon, they began to read the post. I was on my second set of split squats when I started noticing something strange about the story they were reading. It seemed oddly familiar. As it continued, the details kept amassing, to a point where I was unable to was a coincidence. It was describing something that happened to me, something I had never told anyone and had only gone through with one other person. But everything it was saying was wrong. I finished my exercises early, skipped the showers, and drove home in a rush. I listened to it again when I got back to the apartment, the story echoing around the walls from my smart speaker. When it finished, I listened again. Halfway through, I began to Google key phrases, trying to see where they had found this story. Nothing, nowhere, no hits. It wasn't online anywhere, or if it was, I couldn't find it. In the middle of a clawing, desperate anxiety, this drove me insane for some reason. Wasn't this allegedly from the internet? If it was, there should be some kind of trace somewhere. But instead it was all dead ends. I Googled the pod and found an email where you could send comments about the show or submit a story. It could have been submitted, but then I thought of the host saying this story was brand new. There was no way this was just submitted because the only other person other than me who knew this story, the person whose viewpoint the whole story was from, they couldn't have sent the email in. My email to the pod was insane, partially caps locked, sent unedited in the context of an ever-escalating panic attack. I demanded information about where they got the story, who sent it in, their contact info, anything. I was surprised to get a response, although I guess the people who run a paranormal podcast are probably used to getting unhinged emails. They said they couldn't provide me any personal info, but thanked me for being a fan and linked their Patreon. They said we are together on the roads. I read the email as the episode kept playing. It was entitled A Long Drive Home, and I listened again. I was in college, out of state, and I made friends with a guy in my dorm who, it turned out, was from around where I had grown up. I don't want to give details. I'm sorry if this is vague, but I'm not comfortable with it. For Thanksgiving break I was going to fly home, but he told me a few weeks before he was going to drive back and asked if I wanted a ride. The flight was expensive, and this seemed a much better option. We both got along, lived on the same floor, saw each other pretty regularly. The ride was only 5 hours, not super long. We would split gas and avoid the airport lines. It felt like a win-win. Our last classes were at noon on Tuesday, so we decided to leave then. We'd make it back by 6 or 7 at the latest, depending on how often we stopped. I meet up in his room, and we walked to the student parking lot. We had hung out a bunch as a group, but only a few times without anyone else. I was worried it would be awkward, but everything felt normal. We drove off, getting onto the interstate after 20 minutes of driving. We had eaten before leaving, hoping to save some time. The drive was uneventful for the beginning, listening to some playlist, then he put on a podcast. The pod was kind of weird. Some guy talking about how there are patterns in the world, and he travels back and forth looking for them. After a few minutes I asked if we could listen to music again, and he said, just wanted to hear 2 more minutes. Even though it was cold outside, the car had started to feel warm. The sun was coming through the windows, and I was getting that overwhelmed, too hot in the car feeling. Vaguely nauseous, headache. The droning voice over the speaker didn't help. I remember the guy saying, you are on the path when the world outside the path begins to vanish. The signs you are seeking you. That's when he turned it off. Indie pop filled the car again, but there was too much treble. I chugged some water and coughed. He asked if I was okay at the same time we passed a sign for a rest stop in 2 miles. I said I was fine, but wondered if we could stop there. Sure, he said, no problem. 2 minutes later we were there. The rest stop was desolate. 1 car parked at the far left of the lot. No one else. We pulled in next to the handicapped parking area and got out. I had been hoping the fresh air would make me feel better, but no go. I still felt overheated and anxious. He said he had to use the bathroom and walked over to the desolate-looking building. It had a low roof and was the gray bruised color of storm clouds. Behind it, an overwhelming forest loomed. Something about the unending aspect of the trees began to overwhelm me. How could I tell if they were even real? There would be no way to tell if they just repeating images, one section of forest glitched, repeating infinitely. When they walked out of the bathroom, they went straight back to the car. I thought they would come over, say hi, be normal, but they didn't. I took one last look at the trees, hoping they would stop looking like, well, the way they were. But they still seemed eerie. Turning to walk away, I happened to glance at the park bench and see there was a drawing on it. A long red line, an arrow with points on both ends. Across the top, strange words, Latin I think. Quisque suas pater manes. I should have seen that before. I remember thinking I had been right here. I would have noticed a drawing. But I hadn't. Because there wasn't anything there, I thought. But that was crazy. Things don't just appear. Do they? He honked the car and I jumped. I looked back and I could only see his shadow behind the wheel. Stay calm, I thought, as I trudged across the grass, away from the trees and picnic bench. You're just weirding out. This is a normal day. Stop freaking out. I got in the car and we started to drive. The podcast was back on and I didn't say anything. He was completely silent, staring straight ahead. I closed my eyes, tried to relax. I hadn't gotten a lot of sleep the past few days because of midterms. Maybe I just needed a nap. I'd felt better, I thought. As I drifted off to sleep, I listened to the podcast. When we travel the roads, we think we are searching for answers. But what we must realize is that there are others who have been there before us, who are still there. When we go into the dark, they are waiting for us, and it is they who ride down the long roads. We are passengers. We are spectators. We are hosts. The words faded as I slipped into sleep. Weird dreams, confusing images. A graveyard where people buried themselves. A school where secret doors contained passages into strange wooded areas filled with wolves and what looked like vampires. An ancient lighthouse where I waited for the end of the world to come in from the sea. The car jerked to a halt, and I woke up suddenly. My mouth was fuzzy, and I was disoriented. Where are we? I asked. A rest stop, he answered. I needed to take a break. Okay, I said, yawning. He opened the door and walked out. I blinked, and then saw where we were. A low-slung rest stop off the highway. One car in the distance. A picnic table. Never-ending woods. No, I started muttering, panic in my voice. This isn't happening. This isn't real. It's a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. I screwed my hands into fists and banged my legs with them, scratched my palms with my fingernails. I had to do something to stop sleeping, stop dreaming. The podcast was still talking, even though the car was off. There are two worlds we know of, it said. The living and the dead. There are some who are in one or the other. Some are in both. We can move in each, but we must be careful. There are debts. I jumped out of the car. I didn't run to the trees. I didn't run to the building. Instead, I jogged across the parking lot, to the car at the other end of the lot. The sun was low in the sky and it seemed to white, giving off a dull shining glow like silver. Was it even the sun? It didn't feel like the sun. The other car was a black SUV with black windows. I saw myself reflected as I ran to it, but something about me looked wrong. I felt sick, suddenly nauseous. I stopped moving and waited. That's when I saw him come out of the bathroom. His shadow wasn't. I don't know how to explain it. The sun was above and in front of him, so his shadow should have been behind him. But it wasn't. It was in front of him, and it was stretching out across the pavement, long and skinny and strange, like black tape, getting closer to me while he stood, watching. My heart bursting, I ran to the other car, slammed my hands against the windows, screamed for help. The car started. There was a whirring noise. The window came down. I was in the car, in the driver's seat. It was the car I had driven there in. The me in the car looked at me and whispered, "I'm sorry," and then the window closed and I fell down to the ground. I don't know what happened next, or how it happened, but I was back at home. My mom said she ran out to the grocery store, and when she got back I was there, on the couch. I didn't ask any questions. I told her I was sock and went to my room. My phone was there, and there were a million texts and notifications. I started reading through them. They were asking if I was okay, if I had heard. They said the guy I had driven back home with had posted a suicide note and killed himself. I don't know what to do. That's why I emailed this. Because I don't think the person who died was really the person who drove me here. I don't think I'm the person I was, or maybe there's another me somewhere. I could swear I heard my voice downstairs a few minutes ago, talking to my mother. That's how the podcast ends. All of it was wrong. First off, they were driving. I didn't have a car at school freshman year. They lived on my hall, and when we found out we lived close to each other, they offered me a ride home. And there was no podcast. We had a shared playlist we played the whole there. And when only stopped once, we both used the bathroom, and I got out first. I do remember looking at the T's. I remember thinking they also looked like they repeated. But I didn't say that to them at all. I don't understand how they were saying that. The Latin phrase. I googled it. Quisque suas pater manes. It's from the Aeneid. It means we all suffer the same ghosts. I don't know what any of this means. The whole ride with them was weird. At some point I fell asleep, and it seemed like it was too long. I had these strange dreams, although I forgot them until now. I had seen myself in a car, driving with sunglasses on. I walked over to the car, and the me in the car took the sunglasses off. They had no eyes. Above me the whole sky was white, and the clouds were blue, and the sun was a silver coin that stole all the heat from me. The ending is all messed up. I'm alive. I didn't die. I woke up in the car, and we were in front of my house. Well, here you are, they said. End of the road. What about you, I asked. Are you close? No, they said. I have a long way to go. They drove off, and I went inside. I thought everything was done. I said hi to my parents, played with the dog. My dad asked me if I made good time, and I said decent, and then he asked me if I could move the car into the garage. I went out, thinking he wanted me to move his car, but I was surprised to see the car I had just been in, out there on the curb. I walked over and saw no one in the driver's seat. Maybe for a second I thought I saw them, or a shadow, but then the clouds moved, and I saw there was nothing. No one. I was holding a key fob, and when I clicked the button the doors opened. I slid in, checked the glove compartment, registration, and insurance card with my name. I grabbed my phone and saw our texts were gone. We weren't friends on social media. They were gone. Nowhere. The next few days were crazy. I thought I had gone nuts. People don't disappear. Cars don't just appear. All my memories weren't fake. They were real. I met them. I knew them. But no one else did. This was years ago, and I had finally sort of given up thinking about it, and then I heard this podcast. Everything they said was wrong, but I think they might have been telling the truth. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happened to me, but I don't know if I'm me. I keep thinking of those dreams, and what they said about the two worlds. I think I was in the other one. My car is outside, and I can see someone in it. They're in the driver's seat. I think they look like me. Maybe it's a shadow, a reflection. Maybe it's nothing. But maybe we're all only shadows, visible in some kinds of daylight, but not in others. Her question was absurd, and I had half a mind to walk over and pull my wife's head out of the damn chimney by her feet. Against my better judgment, I suppressed the impulse. Doreen hasn't been the same since we lost Junior. We both haven't. I'm a patient man, too. I can tolerate a lot of heartache. That said, her new obsession had been taking a toll on me. I'm used to discomfort. It wasn't discomfort that was the problem, though. It was what she was finding comfort in that rattled me to my marrow. Heard her before I saw her that first night. I was on the porch, nursing some bottom-shelf whiskey and listening to the crickets chirp, planning on passing out where I sat. A new nightly ritual, as of the last few weeks. Nothing else to do, really. No one to talk to except for Doreen. Unfortunately, though, my wife and I hadn't been talking much in the wake of everything. In the first few weeks after his passing, I'd talk to her, but it's tough to converse with someone that gives you nothing in return. You see, she hadn't spoken a word since Junior's death. A lot of wailing, but no actual language. Not a peep. 4 months, 3 weeks, and 6 days of wordlessness. Expressive mutism is what the doctor called it, which only made the first words she said in months that much worse. Hollering like a smoke alarm, she asked me that goddamned question from somewhere inside our home. Have you ever looked up through a chimney, Jim? I sprinted inside, the front door slamming behind me, face flushed from the booze and the exertion. Not sure what I expected to see, honestly. But, room to room, I didn't see her anywhere. She had been practically bed-bound for weeks, and now, somehow, she had vanished. That really put some jet fuel into my veins. The blood pumping through my heart was almost painful, felt sludgy, like it really had turned into black, viscous fuel. Before I could truly start to panic about her whereabouts, I heard her speak again. This is probably what it looked like through Junior's eyes, right before he passed, shouted my wife, voice muffled. She was much closer than I expected, so her shout startled the hell out of me. I peered over the couch in our living room, following where the sound had come from, and there she was. Head, neck, and shoulders in the chimney. Her torso and legs spilled out of the fireplace like a forked tongue from the devil's open mouth. "Have you ever looked up through a chimney, Jim?" she shouted again, her voice coarse and cracking from how loudly she was projecting the question. Call me a shitty husband, but I didn't respond. I just walked away up the stairs into our bedroom and closed the door. Took my whiskey to bed like I was having an affair. All the while, Doreen kept asking that singular question, screaming the words so loud that I could hear her from where I was. In the weeks after his passing, Doreen was practically catatonic. I think it was the nature of Junior's death that utterly preoccupied her. I understand why. It preoccupied me too. No one could tell us how he died. The medical examiner blamed his heart, but that's because he couldn't find anything else on the autopsy. Other than a few strangely shaped scars that we didn't have an explanation for, Junior was perfectly unremarkable. And yet, he was dead at 23. How could that man, with all his training, not tell me how our son died? How my only boy passed on from this life? It felt so cruelly anticlimactic. Junior was our lives, and he had so much promise. How could he just give out like an old radiator? His death didn't match his value in life. It was like someone trying to force me to believe that 2 + 2 = 11. It just didn't add up. There was no equilibrium to it. Made it hard for our minds to compute and understand. I suppose the ambiguity of it all was eating away at Doreen. Not that she ever told me that specifically. It's a bit of an assumption on my part, based on her behaviors before she disappeared. When I woke up that next morning, the house was quiet. I figured my wife had tuckered herself out from whatever insane fit she had been having, but I was sorely mistaken. I found Doreen in the kitchen, standing like a statue in front of an empty wall. Between her and the wall, there was a Pringles can that she had popped the bottom out of, and she had her left eye looking through it like a telescope. Except she wasn't looking at anything. She was leaning her face forward so hard that she didn't even need to hold up the can. Doreen had created a tight seal between her eye and the wall, which I assumed was pitch black on the inside. A disturbing kaleidoscope to nothing and nowhere. But that's not what she saw, apparently. Instead, she told me, she was seeing into the afterlife. She didn't call it the afterlife, though. My wife didn't call it heaven or the great beyond, or any other pleasant euphemism for the end of existence. Doreen called it the depths, and according to her, she was looking right at Junior. He was standing with his eye pressed against the other side of the can, looking right back at her from where the wall was. In not so many words, Doreen explained that if she couldn't know how he died, she at least wanted to know what his last moments looked like, what he saw as he was dying. That's what made her look through the chimney in the first place, apparently. And when she did, it made her feel closer to Junior. She was consumed by experiencing what our son had as his vision faded, what it looked like when the world became distant and darkness started closing in. And that's how she found him again. When I slapped the can away from her, begging her just to talk to me about how she felt, she scurried away, laid down and slid her head back into our fireplace. As much as I tried, I couldn't coax her back out. When I finally did attempt pulling her out, she screamed like a rabid animal, shaking and seizing like I was somehow hurting her. When I couldn't watch any longer, I let her scamper back into her original position. Didn't want to call the cops, they would have just institutionalized her. Thought about an ambulance, too. But I was angry. At her, the world, and God most of all. So I left her there. She didn't move for days, and she kept asking me the same question, day and night. Loud, happy, horrible shouts. Have you ever looked up through a chimney, Jim? I never responded, but that didn't seem to bother her much. The question felt almost rhetorical, like she was just marveling at whatever she was seeing, rather than earnestly asking me a question. One day, I watched her skitter up the chimney, her body rapidly disappearing into the fireplace's black maw, nails audibly scratching against the brick. I think I found him, Jim, she proclaimed, the words echoing faintly into the living room from somewhere deep inside the chimney. And then there was nothing. Doreen didn't crawl out the top, nor did she fall back down to the bottom. She was just gone. Last night, I put my head down over the kindling and looked up, unsure of what else to do now that my wife was gone and the whiskey had run out. Honestly, I think I did see what Doreen was talking about. The sky was like a faraway, peaceful movie that was fading from view. But that wasn't all. Eventually, if I squinted, I began to see a curve in the chimney, a tunnel. Halfway up, folding off the path like an exit on the interstate. I wasn't sure how I'd get there. As I tried to pull myself up, however, thousands of tiny black hands sprouted from spaces between the bricks, helping me up and into the chimney. Maybe that's where Doreen and Junior are, I thought, as the cavalcade of hands pushed me further up, towards the curve. When I approached, I got a glimpse into it. The tunnel that coiled forward off the curve seemed to go on forever. As it did, the brick of the chimney slowly transitioned into continuous red rock that pulsed and squished with some internal current. The smell that emanated from it was simultaneously enticing and revolting, floral and deathly, like a pot of lilacs growing out of rotting pork instead of dirt. And if I angled my head just right, I saw him. At the very end of that coil, miles and miles away, I saw Junior, but he was angry at me. He shook his head in disapproval, and the black hands let go, dissolved into nothingness. I fell 10 or so feet down onto the kindling, breaking my wrist in the process. Snapped the damn thing to pieces. Doreen must have learned something in the last few days. Something that allowed her to be accepted by Junior, unlike me. Something I still had to learn. Maybe it just takes time. Practice makes perfect, after all. And it only took a few days of practice for Doreen to find the depths. I shouldn't be too far behind. My town is old, its roots deep and tangled, drinking something that has always been here. Almost everyone can trace their blood back to the first settlers, Finnish immigrants who laid the first bricks, built the first roads, carved the town from the earth. They came in boats, arrived in winters, walked the frozen forests and built homes where the ground swallowed their footprints. On the surface, it's like any other small town. Quiet, insular, familiar. But there's a tradition here. Something that doesn't belong to us, but we carry anyway. Something older than the town itself. Sulaphoria. The church bells ring for it. The radio hums with it. The diner booths whisper it over black coffee. It used to happen rarely. Once, twice a year, after long dedication, like a prize at the end of devotion. Now it happens every day. Somewhere, someone is achieving. Somewhere, someone is gone. The first time I witnessed someone achieve Sulaphoria was at the bar with Melody. "Did you hear about Hansel?" she asked, swirling her drink. "He achieved last night. Just lay in the snow and poof. Gone." Hansel had vanished 2 weeks ago. The night after that, Dave spent hours lowering himself into hotter and hotter water, grinning as steam curled from his skin. Melody and I were growing desperate. We had tried everything. Wax burns, sauna sits, fasting until our ribs counted for themselves. Nothing. We were still here. That night, the bar was packed wall to wall. No laughter, no breaking glass. The usual drunken shouting had been replaced by something quieter. Something electric. I tapped someone's shoulder. "What's going on?" Artur turned. Gaunt, cheekbones carved sharp, his skin stretched thin from months of the water diet. He had the look of someone almost there. Someone waiting to be taken. "They found a new way," he whispered. At the center of the room, 3 young men stood in black togas, each holding a shot glass. The crowd held its breath. In perfect unison, they drank. A single second stretched, unbearably long. The air shimmered. Then, their bodies softened, blurred at the edges like a heat mirage. The folds of their skin began to separate, like liquid pulling apart. The moment hung viscous, heavy. They dissolved. Their clothes collapsed onto the floor, still damp with sweat and spilled liquor. Sulaphoria. The crowd erupted. Cheers. Shouts. People slamming their glasses down on the bar, ordering rounds of tequila. "I'll have what they had." "That's all it took?" Melody nudged a crumpled toga with the toe of her shoe. "How long have we been trying?" "All they did was what?" "Do some fucking shots." People were vanishing everywhere now. A diner had lost their entire staff overnight. Kids wandered the streets, their parents gone mid-breakfast, their plates still warm. It wasn't that it was strange, just disappointing that it hadn't happened for me. I ordered a shot of tequila, same as the 3 from before. I closed my eyes as I tipped it back. Swallowed. Waited. Nothing. The bar was suffocating. My vision doubled. Was this it? Was this the moment before? Maybe I wanted it too much. Through the blur, I saw Melody across the room, swaying, eyes fluttering, deep in conversation with a group of strangers. I pushed through the crowd. Their words tangled together, melting dispersion, flux, all spoken with an evangelical urge. It wraps around you, pulls you through, then bam, gone. A man turned toward me, his expression shifting. "What? Have you seen?" The world tilted. Something clenched in my stomach. My breath felt too slow. The light smeared across my vision. I muttered something, maybe something blasphemous. It was one thing to speak of how someone achieved. It was another thing entirely to claim to know what happened after. Only the ones who see had that right. His expression darkened. Before I could react, his fist caught me across the jaw. I hit the floor, too dizzy to get up. The crowd laughed, Melody shouting for them to stop, but I hardly noticed. The floor was sticky with sugar and evaporated beer. It was warm, hopeful. My limbs numbed. The bodies above me blurred, undulating like wax, shifting, changing, melting into each other. Then I saw him. The man who hit me. His skin creased, pulled open, unzipped. Droplets of him lifted into the air, tiny globes of light reflecting the faces of the crowd. Each drop held something, a memory, a moment, dissolving, fading away. His body remained for a second longer. Hollow. Something moved inside. A thread-thin worm, white and delicate, crept forward. It lingered, drinking up the droplets, pulling them into itself. It did not look hurried or full. By the time I blinked, there was nothing left but clothes. The music swelled back into focus. The crowd cheered, bodies pressing against each other, breath warm, damp, drunk with it all. I turned to Melody, my breath unsteady. "What was that? Did you see that?" She scoffed, kicking at the empty clothes on the floor. "Yeah, a bunch of bullshit is what that was." I didn't remember getting home. I woke up to a hangover and a phone call. Melody's mother. She was crying, but it wasn't grief. She was so sick after the bar, she said. I told her that's what happens, but then the vomiting stopped and sulaphoria. A breath, shuddering. Reverence. It was beautiful, Jessica. I wish you could have been there. Melody was gone. Just like that. I pressed my hand to my stomach, waiting for something to twist, to ache, but I only felt empty. As it says in the methods of sulaphoria, the dispersed live on your breath. So I exhaled. I collapsed back into bed, tried to sleep the rest of it off. I kept the radio on while I worked the next day. 93.7 FM, The Melt. The host's voice was warm, unhurried. A record number of achievements this season, folks. We'll be taking calls after the break. Who do you think will be next? Could be you, could be me, could be your next door neighbor. Ain't it a beautiful thing? Outside, people sipped coffee at the cafe, gossiping about who might be next. The diner across the street was short-staffed again. More empty aprons left in the back, more half-eaten meals cooling on abandoned plates. No one seemed alarmed. I kept shelving books, trying to focus, but my fingers caught on something strange. A book I didn't recognize. It wasn't in the system. No barcode. A pamphlet slipped free. Its cover was cracked, gold lettering peeling at the edges. But I knew the word. Sulaphoria. Beneath it, a subtitle, The Tracks of the Seers. Inside, the handwriting was uneven, jagged, smudged where the ink had been pressed too hard. A passage caught my eye. Abe the First went away with the snow, and Claire followed in the water. We all knew that phrase. One of the first things we were taught. A simple way to remember the methods. But beneath it, in handwriting that did not belong to the original text. Who saw them go? A seer. A weight settled in my chest. Someone had left this here. Someone wanted me to read it. At the back of the pamphlet, a note. Come before sundown. An address. I shut the book, tucked the pamphlet inside. I could pretend I never saw it. I could throw it away. Instead, I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the cold. The windshield was frozen over, a thin pane of ice sealing me in. A perfect sheet of white, like the world outside had been scrubbed away. I turned on the defrost, but the cold clung stubbornly to the glass. I reached into the back seat, fingers stiff as I fumbled for the scraper. My knuckles ached, the dry air pulling at my skin. The moment I touched the handle, something shifted. A whisper, soft at first, curling at the edges of my ears, barely louder than my own breath. It was easy to ignore, like the sound of the house settling at night, the distant hum of a street lamp, something just on the verge of being real. The ice on the windshield cracked. A fine, hairline fracture webbed outward, slow and deliberate. The whisper wasn't alone. More voices joined, layering, shifting, a chorus pressing against my ears. Some were too distant to hear. Some felt too close. My breath came shallow, my pulse knocking against my ribs. The voices tangled, rose, folded over each other. The more I tried to make sense of them, the worse it became. My name, not spoken but exhaled. Melody? I whispered. The windshield groaned. The fractures deepened, spidering outward, the ice straining against itself, warping under a pressure I couldn't see. It wasn't the defrost. It wasn't the heat. It was something else. A quote from the Methods of Sulphoria came to me. They live at the moment of liminal matter. I gripped the scraper tighter, but my hands were useless. The voices wove through the air, a low hum beneath my skin, a vibration in my bones. The glass shuddered. I was sitting in my car, the heater blasting, and I had never felt colder. A voice, breathless and hollow, like wind through bone. "Jessica." I threw the door open and stumbled onto the pavement, the cold biting into my skin. My breath came hard and fast, vapor pluming into the air. The world had emptied. No wind, no whispers, just the weight of the quiet pressing down on me, thick as snow melt. I stood still, waiting. My ears rang with the absence of sound. My fingers flexed around the scraper. The windshield was still frozen, the fractures holding steady. The ice had just begun to melt. I forced myself to move, scraping away at the frost, my hands trembling. I should have gone to the address. I didn't. Instead, I went home. The house swallowed me whole. The door shut behind me, the air thick, humid, stale. I stood in the dark, waiting for my body to feel like it belonged to me again. I called for my dog. Arcades. No paws against the wood, no skittering claws. "Come here, bud." Silence. The kind that settles over a graveyard. I stepped into the kitchen. The faucet dripped, the sound loud in the stillness. The water in his bowl rippled. His collar rested beside it, the red nylon damp, coiled into itself like shed skin. His tag gleamed under the kitchen light, unreadable, as if the letters had been smudged out. I knelt, reaching for the collar. It was still warm. I pressed my fingers to the floor where he should have been. No fur. No sign that he had ever existed except for the space he left behind. This isn't happening, I thought. Animals don't achieve. Do they? I thought about calling someone, anyone. But who would I call? Melody would know what to do. But Melody was gone. My father was gone to the mist off a boat, and my mother in the steam of a shower. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned. The water in Arcade's bowl trembled, a single ripple breaking across the surface. I bolted to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged over. My reflection barely visible, warped, stretched. I peeled off my jacket, turned the shower knob, and let the steam rise like breath from a chasm. Heat wrapped around me, thick and cloying, dampening my skin before the water even touched me. I stepped inside. The hot water pounded against my skull. My muscles loosened, my thoughts dissolved. I closed my eyes and let myself drift. "Jessica." My eyes snapped open. Water streamed down the walls, gathering in slow, crawling rivulets. The steam thickened. Something moved in it. Not a shape or a person. Just a sense of something. "Jessica." I turned too fast, feet slipping against the wet tile. Caught myself on the wall. My fingers dragged through the condensation, leaving frantic, smeared lines. The whisper came again. Closer. "Jessica." The steam curled around me, pressing into my skin, heavy, clinging. A dozen voices. 100. 1,000. Then they all spoke at once. "Seer." The air snapped, the voices vanished, the steam exhaled. I stumbled back, hit the shower knob. I clutched the sink, staring at my reflection through the thinning fog. My face looked wrong. Hollow. The whispers were gone. But they weren't really. They had always been there, hiding in the liminal matter. I understood. I turned off the water, pulled on my clothes with shaking hands. I didn't want to be in the house anymore. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I grabbed the tract of the Seers and my car keys. The note had said, "Come before sundown." I was going, because what else was there to do?